Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, we'd like to welcome you to today's Intertie Schedule Modeling Enhancement Stakeholder Workshop. My name is Christina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs. I will be facilitating today's meeting. And I'm joined in the room by Milos Kosanev and George Angelides, and online by Andrew Ulmer, Abdul Muhammad Ali, Danny Johnston, Jamil Daouk, and James Lynn. And just a few friendly reminders here before we get started. Today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And this meeting is intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives. So please keep your comments professional and respectful today, and please do try to keep your comments and questions succinct so that we're able to hear from everyone. And if you'd like to access closed captioning, that's available on the bottom left of your screen, and the Intertie transparency viewer to view other callers on the call is located on the bottom right hand of your screen, so be sure to refresh that before viewing. And we welcome and look forward to your engagement and participation in today's meeting. For raising your hand during the meeting, you can use the raise hand icon directly at the bottom of your WebEx screen. And if you joined audio only, you can join the queue by pressing *3 on your device. And please remember to state your name and affiliation first before making a comment. And please make sure to pause a few seconds before speaking after you unmute to avoid any WebEx delays that can cut off your introduction. And you can also send in your comments and questions via chat by selecting all panelists before sending the chat. And if you need any technical assistance today during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer and Teller Events. Today, Milos Kosanev will get us started with a meeting overview. Then he'll take us into some recaps. First one in SP design and gap tie design modeling of intertie schedules, and the second one on RA imports into the KISO balancing area under gap tie modeling design. And afterwards, George Angelides will discuss enhanced scheduling limit constraints before we wrap up for the day with next steps. So with that, I will turn things over to Milos Kosanev to get us started.
Thank you, Christina, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another workshop on the topic. Today's discussion, we wanted to particularly focus on bringing some of the pieces together from some of the technical discussions that we've had over the last couple of workshops. Those have been fairly technical. We wanted to bring now those discussions together and recap where we've been, provide a bit more justification and rationale for the concepts that have been introduced. And then we'll introduce the topic, an additional topic here that George will cover, which is consideration of some enhanced schedule limit constraints on the ISO interties. But for today's workshop, we'll cover the current SP tie design for modeling intertie schedules in the balancing area and some of the challenges associated with that modeling that's causing us to look at alternate designs like the gap tie design for modeling intertie schedules. And then we'll spend a little bit of time recapping the prior workshop on how RA imports into the ISO balancing area would work under the gap tie design. And we'll walk through different scenarios that were covered fairly technically in the last meeting. We'll look to recap those a bit more and make sure that there is a fair understanding among stakeholders of what that would look like under a gap tie design for modeling intertie schedules. We also wanted to touch on, and this has been part of other workshops and we've been raised in passing, but we wanted to just spend a few minutes as well noting the expectations that if we were to move to and enhance the intertie schedule modeling design to the gap tie design, how that would align with, or how we would align the modeling of congestion revenue rights in the ISO balancing area at the interties with that design as well. And then, as I mentioned, George will introduce a new topic for discussion here. We thought this would be a good forum since we're talking intertie schedule modeling enhancement, that this particular topic that is relevant and it's arising in other context or in more narrow context, but is an appropriate place to raise it here in these discussions and receive stakeholder feedback on potential considerations of enhancing schedule limit constraints at certain ISO balancing area interties. In the next workshop that we have yet to schedule, but it will be in July, We will expect to then shift the discussion from the gap tie design and modeling and more to the second topic that I think more substantive, which is looking at phasing out intertie bidding at EDAM internal interties between the ISO balancing area and another EDAM balancing area, and what are the considerations and associated impacts and potential mitigations in that particular scenario. But that will be the topic of the next workshop. We wanted to spend today kind of bringing the discussion today together, introducing an additional topic, and I think that will set us up well for the next workshop to move on to intertie bidding at internal interties between EDAM balancing areas in the CAISO and the effects of how to phase that out. If we go to the next slide. So just starting just with a bit of context, again, this is common across the last workshops, but we may have some folks that are maybe new to the topic that are joining us. Just to set a bit of context and history of kind of why we're looking at this initiative and how we got here. But you may recall that last year, as we were approaching EDAM implementation, we held a series of EDAM implementation workshops to discuss intertie scheduling in the EDAM context, particularly on the CAISO interties. And as part of those implementation discussions last year, we committed to retaining the existing or the pre-EDAM intertie schedule modeling design for the CAISO balancing area intertie on a transitional basis. And that's what we call the schedule point tie or SP tie modeling design that I'll touch on a little bit. But as part of the EDAM implementation, we retained that SP tie modeling for intertie schedules, recognized as a transitional design that we would further evolve through the stakeholder discussions that we're starting now, or we started a few months ago under this particular initiative, to evaluate a transition to more accurate modeling design for intertie schedules, particularly in the ISO balancing area interties. That's where we discussed and considered the generation aggregation point or gap tie modeling design for improving that accuracy of intertie schedules that I'll touch on a little bit later. But these discussions, as well as part of this initiative, would allow us the ability to consider the potential impacts of moving to that design, impacts to commercial arrangements. It would just allow us additional time to consider all of those implications when considering to evolve that intertie schedule modeling design. We go to the next slide. So there are a couple of key elements of the transitional design on the ISO interties that we need to address. These designs are currently in place as the EDAM launched in May. So all of these, the SP tie design, the retention of the SP tie modeling design is still in effect as the EDAM has launched. But we committed to, as I mentioned, of evolving that design of intertie schedule modeling and considering moving towards the gap tie design, recognizing the different implications for CRR modeling, for how RA imports may be delivered, and other aspects of transacting at those interties. That's one element, transitioning that SP tie modeling design. The second key element of the discussions, and that's what I mentioned a couple of slides ago, we would be moving into in the next workshop on, but is how to evolve the design on intertie bidding on the EDAM internal interties. Under the transitional design that we have in place and that's in effect with EDAM here launched in May and that FERC approved, under that transitional design, we continue to permit intertie bidding in limited instances on the ISO interties, EDAM internal interties between the ISO balancing area and another EDAM balancing area. Those limited circumstances where intertie scheduling is still permitted at those locations, even though those locations now support transfers. Intertie bidding is allowed in limited instances at those locations for RA imports into the ISO balancing area, as well as imports that may be under RPS contracts. And that's something that we discussed in the implementation workshops as a limited and narrow scope of continued intertie bidding at the EDAM internal interties. And as part of this effort, we are also going to discuss how to evolve and phase out, ideally, direct intertie bidding at those EDAM internal interties, but understanding what the impacts are and other considerations of potentially phasing that out. And like I said, that will be subject of the next workshop that will focus on, once we've established a good and grounded understanding on intertie schedule modeling and what we may be shifting from the SP tie design to the gap tie design. I think that sets up a good basis for then talking about phasing out bidding at the EDAM internal interties and what the impacts of that are and what may be mitigations that could be considered. If we go to the next slide. So here I'm going to start in these next few slides just to recap a bit of the past discussions on the differentiations between the SP tie design and the gap tie design for modeling of intertie schedules. I think it was important that, based on the stakeholder comments that we saw, we felt it was a need to maybe do a recap of this and ground us a little bit more into why we're looking at moving away from the SP tie design and improving the accuracy of modeling intertie schedules, particularly on the KISO balancing area intertie. So these next few slides are going to cover a bit of how the SP tie design works that's currently in place during this transition on a transitional basis on the ISO interties for modeling intertie schedules. And then what are some of the challenges or drawbacks associated with that approach that are causing us to look at improving the accuracy of modeling those intertie schedules and moving to a gap tie design. And we'll cover a bit of how that gap tie design works in practice. And then I think we can pause for some questions, any clarifications that we need to make. But it's important that we at least understand the motivation for considering an improved and more accurate modeling of intertie schedules and the implications that that has. So if we go to the next slide. Starting with just the current design on the modeling of intertie schedules on the KISO balancing area, that's the SP tie modeling design. This is the design that's currently in place, even with the EDAM launch as of May. And the current design for intertie schedule modeling is based on the schedule point tie, SP tie structure, as I mentioned earlier. Under this structures for import schedules, the energy injection is modeled as if there was a fictitious generator that was located directly at the intertie location between the KISO balancing area and another balancing area. Based on that modeling, as if the generator was injecting energy at that direct intertie location, effectively a number of things flow from that. We model the generation shift factors and the contributions to different constraints from that location, as if the power flowed directly from that intertie location across the grid, its contribution to different constraints on the grid, but it also impacts congestion management and the actions that the market may take, as well as operators, based upon the modeling of that injection as if it were coming directly from that intertie location, where we know that there's not a physical generator actually located, but we model it as if it was there. And there's, as you'll see on the next couple of slides, there's some challenges associated with that, or drawbacks that poses, particularly because centered around the fact that the actual flows or the actual power flows may not materialize in that same way as we're modeling the injection at that intertie location. The actual power flows, as you get closer to that operating horizon, the actual power flows may materialize or are likely to materialize in a different way because there's no generator at that intertie location. We go to the next slide. So some of those drawbacks that we try to highlight in prior meetings, but I think this is a good opportunity of these next couple of slides to tease that out a little bit more. But the underlying structure of the current design for modeling intertie schedules impacts the accuracy and the modeling of those effects at those locations. So one impact that it has is that it creates certain inefficiencies in the market, in both the day-ahead market as well as associated with the HASP results. Under this particular SP tie design, where we model a generator directly at the intertie locations, we assume that the power is going to flow that way, particularly in the day-ahead market, and as if the generation was located at that intertie location and was injecting the power, and it was flowing across the grid and impacting the different constraints. And that may impact the market solution in the day ahead, particularly in one way because of those assumptions. And it may be different than how the power flows actually materialize in the operating horizon. In the day ahead time frame, it could potentially contribute to what we call also phantom congestion and potentially lead to inefficient day ahead market results because it makes certain assumptions about the congestion effects of those energy injections as if they were sourcing directly from the intertie location. And they may be different in the real-time horizon in the operational time frame. So that's one impact, is the inefficiencies that it may create in the day-ahead market results because of those assumptions that may not be accurate. Another impact is the reduced effectiveness and accuracy of congestion management that may result from those inaccurate modeling assumptions that the generation for these imports is sourcing directly at the intertie locations. Those inaccurate modeling assumptions can have congestion effects, particularly resulting from those intertie schedules, and they can affect how the market solves for that congestion, the congestion that it sees, and the effectiveness of market actions in trying to reduce or mitigate the congestion that it may be seeing in the market, particularly in that day-ahead time frame. And as I mentioned earlier, the actual power flows, once you move to the operating horizon, the actual power flows are very likely different from that because there's no generator directly injecting at that intertie import location. The generation, the actual physical generation that's supplying that is somewhere behind that in another balancing area, and those power flow effects are different than in the operating horizon and may cause challenges again in managing the congestion effect. If the market didn't position as well in the day-ahead time frame, it may create issues that may need to be mitigated in the real-time horizon or by operators once that actual power flow materializes. We go to the next slide. And then another potential impact, again, of that modeling of intertie schedules as if they were sourcing from the intertie location directly, that it reduces the accuracy of the price formation for those intertie transactions. The congestion component, as you know, of the LNP is shaped by the contribution of the generation shift factors that we model from that intertie location to the constraint across the CAISO market footprint, but also across the broadening EDAM footprint. And the impact of, and this could have, because of those inaccuracies that ultimately may be different, the power flows may be different in the real-time horizon, that can impact congestion revenue allocation when those actual physical schedules materialize differently and have different effects on the system in the real-time horizon. The reason that we're looking at undertaking this now when the EDAM is launching and we have a transitional design in place, but we're looking to evolve that design, is that as the EDAM expands and as additional balancing areas join the market in the coming years, how we model those intertie schedules on the CAISO intertie and the accuracy associated with the modeling of these injection and their effects on the grid, it can impact, again, schedules and it can impact congestion and exacerbate some of the congestion effects and pricing impacts across that growing EDAM market footprint. And that's because, again, injections of energy at those intertie locations based on the generation shift factors and their contribution to constraints, we're not looking at those constraints just in the CAISO balancing area, but we're looking at those impacts and contribution to constraints across the EDAM balancing areas. And there could be some effects on the congestion impacts, assuming that the energy is actually being directly injected at that intertie location. When we know that in the real-time horizon and the operating horizon, those power flows are going to materialize differently because there's not a generator, physical generator located at that intertie location. We go to the next slide. I'll go through a few more slides and then I'll pause. I just want to shape the overall picture here. We talked about this a little bit at the last stakeholder workshop as well. We did a little bit of benchmarking to see what other ISOs and RTOs do when they model. They don't necessarily call it intertie schedules. We call it intertie schedules because today it's a direct schedule and modeling of the intertie location. but how do they model schedules from external resources outside of their balancing area or market footprint into their market? And it is not a common approach across the other ISOs that those import transactions or those injections be modeled directly at the intertie location as the ISO does today. As you can see here, between MISO, PJM, and SPP, they all have something similar to the gap tie design that we're looking to move to, in that they're not assuming that a generator is directly physically located at that intertie location, but they make certain assumptions about that source of the generation being in another external balancing area, and then modeling the effects of those assumptions in the market, that it's not coming from directly from the intertie location, but it's coming from another balancing area that has source generation in it, and then they evaluate the effects of those shift factors and contribution to constraints within their market footprint to evaluate the impact, manage the congestion, or model the congestion, and model the pricing as well. Their practices vary a little bit amongst each other. Some of them ultimately, when they're pricing those imports or that generation or that injection of energy from the external balancing area, some of them may look at the weighted average of generation nodes within that balancing area. Others may look at load and generation, and then another may just look at load nodes. But the commonality is that they model that generation as if it were coming from another physical generation in another balancing area, and they price it that base a little bit differently based on those different assumptions that you see there. ISO New England has something that's similar to us today, that they do model the injection of energy directly at the intertie location, and as us, they model the congestion effects from there. For schedules from the New York ISO, they do have certain different modeling assumptions, but they usually model it as the schedule at a transmission bus in that balancing area. But I think it's important to also differentiate that just the volume of imports is significantly different between us and ISO New England, just based on how they're connected and where they're located. They don't have as significant of a volume of imports as the ISO does, so maybe this is okay in that kind of a world. But the ISO has significantly more intertie transactions that it's interties, at least historically to date. So that's the structure of some of how the SPTie design works, and some of the challenges and the practical impacts of continuing to model those energy injections at the intertie locations. Particularly, we can see, as I mentioned, exacerbating issues as the EDAM footprint grows if that inaccuracy persists. And that's what we're looking at. What are there more accurate ways of modeling those generation injections, particularly imports, I'll use as an example? Are there more accurate ways of modeling the effects of those intertie schedules, not only on the CAISO balancing area, but across the footprint when those intertie schedules are submitted at the CAISO balancing area? So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit briefly here about the gap tie design, and we can then pause for questions, but I wanted to contrast the two, and then I think that gives a good basis for some robust discussion. The alternate design that we've been discussing to date, and that we also introduced initially with EDAM and at the implementation workshops last year, but was moving to a generation aggregation point tie or gap tie design for modeling intertie schedules on the CAISO balancing area interties. The gap tie design, or the generation aggregation point, is a representation of aggregate generation within a particular balancing area for purposes of modeling their power flow impact and their generation shift factor and contributions to constraints within the market footprint. But it's looking at a balancing area and then at the aggregate generation within that balancing area and its effects on the CAISO or on the EDAM footprint. The intertie schedules will be modeled as if they were sourcing from that aggregate physical generation that's located in that other EDAM balancing area. And as I mentioned, then we would look and see what are the effects of those generators based on the generation shift factors that we model. What are the effects of that generation and that injection of energy from those physical generators on constraints and congestion, within the market footprint. Under that design, we use what we call the default generation aggregation point, or DGAP, to represent non-source specific supply that's offered at an intertie. Again, that looks at supply resources within a particular balancing area and then uses those generation distribution factors to model the effect on the market in both the day ahead and the real time. I'll mention this a bit later as well, but as we've discussed this thus far across the last couple of workshops, all intertie schedules that under this gap tie design, we would assume by default that they're sourcing from the adjacent balancing area associated with that DGAP, or the default generation aggregation point, but that they're sourcing from that adjacent balancing area for a given intertie location. So per intertie, we would look at the adjacent balancing area that is associated with that intertie between the CAISO and that adjacent BA. And this picture, just the graphic on the right side, just kind of tries to depict that. But at the CAISO balancing area, there's a DGAP that's associated with that, in this example, non-EDAM balancing area. And then the injection and the effect on the grid and congestion, as well as the pricing, they're based on the modeling of those generators that are in that balancing area, the aggregate generation within that balancing area, instead of assuming that that generation is coming directly from that intertie, that red dot location. We go to the next slide. So what are some of the potential benefits of moving to this gap tie design? How does it improve the accuracy of congestion management and price formation? And as we've discussed today, moving to that gap tie design for intertie schedule modeling, we think will more accurately, may not be 100% accurate, but it's a more accurate representation than what we have in place today for modeling the power flows of those intertie schedules by looking to tie that intertie schedule modeling to actual physical generation in the actual, or what's more likely to be, the source balancing area, the neighboring balancing area. This does a number of things. It improves the accuracy of the day-ahead market results as well as the HAS results, because it more closely aligns the model power flow effects in the market that the market takes into account associated with those intertie schedules. But it more accurately reflects those power flows and aligns it more closely to what is likely to occur, to materialize in the operating horizon, because now you're assuming that that generation and the source of that generation is coming not from the intertie directly, where there's no physical generator, but it's coming from that neighboring balancing area and the generation in that neighboring balancing area. It also has the ability to improve the effectiveness and management of congestion by the market, but also within the operational horizon, by again improving that modeling and the assumptions that we make about those intertie schedules and where they're sourcing from. It allows the market now to more accurately, particularly in day ahead, position the footprint, take into account the congestion effects and mitigate those to the extent necessary. But also in the operating horizon, there's alignment between what we assumed and what the market assumed and what actually materializes. That also helps the operators manage grid conditions without having to take different out-of-market actions to manage those effects of power flows that may have materialized differently than expected based on the day-ahead results and what we assumed was coming from the day-ahead result. And then finally, it also improves the accuracy of price formation for those intertie schedules, because by improving the accuracy of the modeling of the source of that generation for modeling those intertie schedules and their relationships to different constraints in the market footprint, it's going to improve the price formation of the LMPs, and particularly that congestion component, and provide more accurate price signals. Moving to the gap tie design is also, I think, another important element is it's going to provide alignment in how we model intertie schedules within both the EDAM and the EIM footprints, because on the EIM and the EDAM balancing area interties, we are already implementing this type of gap tie design for modeling intertie transactions at those locations. And by now migrating the CAISO balancing area to the same design, it will provide more consistent treatment and alignment in how those schedules are modeled and the effect of those types of schedules on constraints in the market footprint. I think I have a couple of more slides, but I think this is a good place to stop, at least in contrasting SP tie and gap tie design, that I think we can take some questions. And I think we have Carrie with a hand raised, and we will then come back to a couple of slides that are more logistical on what data we're making available. But let's take the stakeholder question.
Yeah, if we could please unmute Carrie Bentley.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I apologize if I missed this. This is kind of more of a recap of maybe stakeholder comments from the implementation effort. I guess, Milosh, I was under the impression that no one supported this in the stakeholder community, but there was strong pushback both in the original proposal, and then there was strong pushback again in the implementation proposal. And I feel like your recap, I appreciate that kind of technical recap, but I'm wondering if you could recap why stakeholders pushed back so hard on this, and what the CAISO has done to augment the design to respond to those comments. Thanks.
Yeah, no, good questions. I have to remember now, we did in the last workshop discuss some of the stakeholder feedback, at least within this initiative. But I don't recall the stakeholder feedback pushing back. So yes, there have been a couple of entities like TEA, I think, WPTF, I think, had comments that acknowledged some of the benefits of, at least, of improving the accuracy of the design. But we didn't interpret the pushback as not pursuing the gap tie design, but more as let's continue to evaluate the impact. Let's continue to provide time and air to how to evolve if there are any impacted contractual arrangements. But that's why we did the transitional design, is we needed additional time to discuss with stakeholders and shape what this evolution in intertie schedule modeling needed to look like. What are the impacts and effects? The next part of the discussion where there was more pushback is stuff that we'll cover at the next meeting, which is phasing out bidding at the EDAM internal interties. But associated with the gap tie design, we certainly didn't interpret the comments as predominantly as not pursuing the gap, moving to a more accurate design for intertie schedule modeling, more as seeking to help folks understand how does it impact day-to-day transactions. Where we did experience pushback, as I noted, is something that we'll talk about next time, which is eliminating or phasing out bidding at EDAM internal intertie.
Thanks, Milosh. I don't think you characterized WPTF's comments accurately in that recap. And I guess I was more talking about whether anyone supported you moving forward with this. When I think back to those workshops and when I look at those comments, I don't see any support for moving forward. I do see, people being willing to continue a discussion, because of course stakeholders are always willing to listen to the CAISO. But given the strong support for the CAISO to use their resources on other initiatives, I would just ask that you go back and really review those comments, given the effort it would take to move forward with this, and be very clear in your minds about how stakeholders feel about this. Again, especially given how you just mischaracterized WPTF's own position, I am concerned that the CAISO didn't really review stakeholder feedback before moving forward. Thanks.
No, thanks, Carrie. And let me clarify as well here. This is not yet a proposal. We're not at a proposal stage. We're trying to educate folks on what are the differences and evolutions in the gap, moving to a gap tie design from the SP tie design. I think at the last meeting we covered WPTF comments and other comments. I maybe did a shorthand of it, but WPTF in their last comments noted they recognize there's a recognition of what it means to move to and the improvement in modeling of intertie schedules, but it did note that we should balance that out with market efficiency, impacts on commercial arrangements, and one more item. So I think we covered that at the last meeting, but it wasn't certainly within stakeholder comments to say in the discussions thus far that we should not be at least looking at the gap tie design. And before we put a formal proposal forward, we wanted to walk through and make sure that folks understand what the impacts are of moving to a gap tie design. I think in the next round of comments that we'll be soliciting, we'll have a more specific set of questions for stakeholders to respond to. But certainly, I think we're open to hearing stakeholder feedback of moving to this gap tie design, what the hesitancy associated with it, the implications, especially as we go through some of the more detailed scenarios, RA imports, and how they would work. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Thanks, Carrie. And next in the queue, I see Dan Williams.
Hey, Milos, it's Dan Williams from the Energy Authority. I'm exiting an airport, so if I start getting a lot of background noise, I'll just, you can mute me and we can move on to something else. Looking forward to seeing folks in Albuquerque, and had to get here a day early for the RIF meetings tomorrow. So just a couple thoughts. I did see at the end of the presentation and the next steps that this is something the ISO intends for us to be working on for a while here, that it's going into maybe Q2 2027 before we'd have a final proposal. And I think that tells me that it'd be unlikely to be implemented until very late 2027, if not early 2028. And one of the things that we've been noting here and in the CRR enhancements calls is just that need to line up any impact that this would have on the CRR market with the timing of the annual allocation and auction. So it feels like that is well in place, at definitely not impacting at least the front end of the 2027 cycle. So I was happy to see that. I did have a question about sort of what the ISO thinks as far as, is this a tariff change? Is it business practices? Kind of where it lives in that policy making space. And then I've got a little bit of a comment and follow up after that.
No, thanks, Dan, for that question. Yeah, so the idea behind Q2 2027, as we'll get to the next step slide at the end as well, is, but we're looking to implement this no later than the time that the next, if we have consensus working through the stakeholder process, if we have a formal proposal, but implement that ahead of the next amount of EDAM entities joining in the fall of 2027. As we get to the CRR slide, we can talk a little bit about how, there's mechanisms for transitioning CRRs, even if you're not yet aligned with the annual process, but aligning those with the DGAPs for the different intertie locations. But the idea is to give us enough time here to implement this and go through a market simulation and implement this ahead of the fall of 2027 entrance coming online. To the extent that we have consensus, or depending how it's shaping, this could be done a bit earlier, but that's the schedule based on the discussions that we've had thus far and forthcoming workshops on some of the more thornier items as well. And then your last question was, remind me, Dan.
Just kind of the, does it live in a tariff? Does it live in business practices?
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
Yeah, and we envision this moving to the gap tie design would be a tariff change as we retain the SP tie design under the existing design, under the tariff that we filed recently, or for the transitional design. We have to clarify the tariff that we're retaining the SP tie design, because originally it had the gap tie concepts in it. If we do end up moving to the gap tie design, we would modify the tariff as well to reflect that. And there will be BPMs as well that are impacted.
Right. So then the just brief comment on it, and hopefully my audio is going through okay.
Yeah,
It's just that when it comes to comparing to the other organized markets, and even just in thinking about this, the context matters so much in all of these discussions and in making these choices. I could sort of go market by market in the ones that were listed out and talk about the context of why they made the decisions that they did, what's different there versus CAISO's intertie market and the EDAM, intertie settlements. Trying to choose the right word there. But just broadly, the context matters, and that really is the crux of it for us and for a lot of the folks I've been talking to in the kind of trading and marketing community is that you sort of simultaneously have to be solving for EDAM and what the EDAM entities need, and simultaneously solving for what an import RA market needs, what the like residual CAISO intertie market needs, how day ahead index based on peak and off peak trading is going to continue, over the next few years as we sort of settle into the market evolution. Um, Within all of those, there's just different pieces that matter. Um, and I would say matter as much as attempting to achieve a little bit more, in some cases, modeling accuracy by making a move from the SP tie to the gap tie methodology. And I feel like we really haven't discussed that context sufficiently at this point. Um, Traders aren't always good about discussing, kind of how they do what they do day in and day out, how much that impacts their contracting, what they look at for price formation and the valuation of transmission. It's tough to get folks to look at that until it's actually happening. And I think we saw that last fall with kind of when the changes were headed at us. All of a sudden, you got all kinds of participation in the stakeholder process. So, we've got time here to continue talking about this, and I definitely want to take that opportunity, and we'll continue to try and bring forward a representation of a kind of trading community. I know WPTF will do the same, and we'll try to get other folks involved. Um, but I just want to put that idea out there that uh, there really is no right, perfect answer here. There's just a trade-off to consider between modeling accuracy and how bilateral markets work, between uh, different ways of submitting schedules day ahead, and looking at where resources that back deals ultimately end up being. You know, there's just a lot to consider. So I'll leave it at that, and just kind of look forward to maybe some future opportunities to maybe fill in some blank spots and then see how that sits for the ISO staff and for other stakeholders.
no, thank you. That sounds good. And as I noted for Carrie, there'll be an opportunity in these next round of stakeholder comments that if stakeholders want to be more definitive and more direct on their positions on SP tie and gap tie, I think we're at that stage where that there's an opportunity to do that so that we have a better sense of what are the concerns that stakeholders have with moving to a gap tie design. Because I think at this stage, as I noted from the stakeholder comments, we've seen more of an interest in understanding what are the implications of moving to that design, not outright opposition, recognition that we should consider this in the context of impacts to market efficiency and other aspects. But to the extent that stakeholders and Carrie, WPTF, Dan, and others, you want to be more explicit in the next round of comments, I think we'll have an opportunity to do that and share a little bit some of the perspectives of why is it more appropriate to stay with the SP tie design versus the gap tie design? What are the impacts and concerns, particularly so that we can, I think, work through them in these upcoming workshops.
And Milos, just real quickly, I think that's a good way of characterizing it, because it's not about opposing sort of one way of doing the modeling, one way of accepting schedules and doing price formation and that sort of things is right, and the other one is wrong. It's all shades of what is most practical and what fits within where the market is right now, what's most useful for building towards some ability to transact between markets, and kind of what can we do to move things forward, but move them forward without being overly disruptive at a time when there's a lot of other change going on. And I think that's where there's the majority of differences of opinion, is sort of in what's the right step to take and when, not so much in if we were just looking at a power flow modeling exercise, what would we do? Because that answer is obvious.
Sounds good, Dan. Yeah, we'll take up on that. Certainly we'll shape the questions in such a way that it solicits that type of feedback, and folks can be a little bit more direct on, at this stage, on their perspectives on different ways of modeling these intertie schedules. And that can, I think, move the discussion more directly forward. Okay, we can go to the next.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Next, we can go to Don Trethway.
Hi, Don Trethway, GDS Associates. I have a clarifying question. If we're truly using the adjacent D gap, I'm looking at the physical ties with CAISO, and there's usually just one adjacent BA. So does that mean there's just going to be, in essence, one price per intertie as there is today? It's just that we're moving from modeling it as an injection at the intertie to an injection at the D gap of the adjacent BA. So there's not going to be multiple prices at a given intertie, with the exception of the scheduling points with LADWP and WALT, where we may need to figure that out. But is that true? Is that accurate?
Yes, Don, that is accurate. Even for these other scheduling points with LADWP that you mentioned, currently we have a one-to-one relationship between a scheduling point and an intertie, and we'll maintain that by moving the scheduling point to the adjacent balancing authority area D gap by default. So you'll basically have essentially a single price for every tie.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Next in the queue, we have Tom Wu.
Hi, this is Tong Wu from WAPA. I wonder if the ISO can provide a simplified mathematical formulation for the problem. For example, you have ISO BAA, an external BAA, and then how the price is defined. When the relationship between the SP tie and the D gap is linked, formulated in the formula, does this represent a constraint, or it's not a constraint? So I just don't fully understand what's the effect of this modeling on the price at that transaction point. For example, if you have this gap tie and then at the Malin today I have a price, tomorrow when you do the gap tie, would the price still represent the energy value at that location, or it starts to represent the energy value of weighted average of those generators? And I just don't know. I think a mathematical formula would tell me exactly what it is. But my concern is that this price will not represent the value at that transaction point. So therefore, it will change the valuation of the value of the transmission as well. And it may discourage people from participation because there's no good price to transact. And then nobody's going to buy transmission. So that would devalue the transmission, okay? But I cannot make that certain. I cannot say, hey, definitely that's going to happen, because I don't even understand what the price impact is.
Tom, there is an earlier slide from an earlier presentation that we described the price formation for the SP tie and the gap tie that shows the contribution of different elements to the LMP for the SP tie or the gap tie. And that one essentially gives you, in words, a formulation of how the SP tie is calculated. And we also provided very detailed examples that compared import-export congestion management and settlement, specifically for Malin 500, I think we had in that example, between the existing SP tie at the Malin 5 N101 and the BPA dig-up. We had an example with 3 generators in BPA, and we had run this for imports and exports twice, once for the SP tie model and another again for the gap tie model, and we compared the results. So I think these examples are very illustrative. They will show exactly what the difference will be going from the SP tie to the gap tie. And the generic slide that describes the contributions to the LMP also is very illustrative on what the various components are that contribute to that LMP. So I suggest you have a look at those because they will answer most of your questions that you have.
And Tong, this is Milos, this is the March presentation of this year where we had those more detailed examples. But George, in simplified form, is it fair to say that moving to the gap tie design really predominantly affects the congestion component of the LMP? The energy component is not touched. It's representative of the BA at which it's being scheduled at. But this impacts the modeling change impacts the congestion component because it looks at the contribution of the shift factors to the constraint, which is different than if the generation is sourcing at the intertie versus if it's sourcing at the generation within the neighboring balancing area.
That is correct, and specifically what we call physical congestion impact. The impact of scheduling limits is the same both for the SP tie and the gap tie because it's an attribute of the intertie, which is the same, the Malin 500. And this is what we showed in the examples, changes in the marginal congestion component contribution going from the SP tie to the gap tie. Of course, there is always an indirect effect on your market energy cost because you change slightly the market solution. You have more efficient and more accurate congestion management based on what you presented already, Milos. The effect is a more accurate pricing and congestion outcome, more accurate price solution and market solution. So there is an indirect effect, but the direct effect is the marginal congestion contribution to physical constraints.
Yeah, I would rather see LP formulation, simplified, linear programming formulation that, would allow me to analyze by myself instead of seeing the results that, in one particular example. That's how, I can understand stuff, truly understand what it is. But,
Yeah, even that, Tom, if you want to see the formulation, it hasn't changed since the time that we posted the day-ahead market enhancement technical description that has a section that describes the scheduling limits, the scheduling congestion. The formulation is there, and there is at the end there is a section that describes the price formation. These are all still relevant. So you'll see there the contributions, but I think the slides that we have on those more recent presentations are simpler to follow, give you all the information you need. But the mathematical formulation is still in the same technical appendix or technical description, still there and still relevant.
And Tom,
yeah, I did go through that. I'm not sure that provides sufficient detail, and also a lot of it, formulas at a very high level, hard for me to, focus on the essence of this problem. So I can come up with the different mathematical formulations and then figure out, guess which one is yours. But I just thought that's a lot of effort on my part.
We can look into that, Tom, and maybe Christina, if you just quickly jump for Tom's question to slide 16. Tom, what may help, and I'll get to this in a couple of slides as well, is we started posting advisory information on DGAP pricing for the CAISO balancing area intertie, and you can do a comparison now in Oasis. We started posting this, I believe, last week or the week before. And you can do a comparison by Intertie as well. And that may help you. It maybe doesn't have the mathematical formulation, but you can see in practice the differences in the LMP of the D gap at a particular Intertie location compared to the current design under the SPTI design for a particular Intertie location. And I'll get to this slide a little bit later, but that may also get at what you're looking for in comparing the price differences or similarities across different periods now that that's available. I'll get to it in a couple of slides and show you how to get to that, but that's available externally as well. And it's got the price breakdown by LMP component, the congestion, the energy, and the losses. So you can see what element is being impacted, which is the congestion one under the DGAP design, and what the differences are.
All right, thank you, Tom. Next, we'll take these final two hands before continuing on in the presentation. First, we'll go to Carl Dunkel-Werner.
Hi, this is Carl Dunkel-Werner from Cal Advocates. This is maybe just a quick suggestion, but it'd be very useful going back to Carrie and Dan's point, if you could provide some estimates of what the actual benefits would be here. I'm thinking something along the lines of the EDAM benefits study, where you can, if you can say something like dispatch will be more efficient by this amount, I think that would really help us as stakeholders evaluate the policy proposal. Thanks.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you,
Carl. We can see. Well, let's take that back and see if there's a way to do that or what it would take. But let's think about that.
Looks like we have one more hand raised before we move on. So we'll go to Steve Keen.
Hi, yeah, Steve Keen from Edison. When you answered Don, he asked whether there would be essentially one price per point, per scheduling point. And the answer you gave was per tie, yes.
Per tie,
the answer was yes, and I'm assuming it's like the default D gap. So like someplace like Malin that probably has several different D gaps all coming into Malin. Somehow you pick one. But my question is just, I was reading ahead in the presentation, and on slide 17, there's a thing that says all gap tie, intertie scheduling points would be supported as CRR source sync locations, which seems to me to be in contrast to the previous statement. I'm not sure I understand how you can say at one point there will be one price per tie, and then here you have something that says, well, but for CRRs you can have multiple D gaps for the tie.
Yeah, Steve, this means all gap tie locations used in the market will be supported as CRR sourcing locations. So that will be the adjacent BAA D gap for each tie will also be supported as CRR source at sync locations. Still majorly single price per tie. We did mention in the past that our model supports potentially different gaps, and we did mention that on specific scenarios based on the needs of scheduling coordinators that they have, that they're particularly situated, like they know exactly, for example, where the energy is coming from an EIM BAA or a non-EIM BAA. For EIM BAA is more relevant. We can use the concept of the custom gap to support these exceptions, right? These are exceptions, but in general, there will be just the adjacent BAA D gap being the default location for each tie, resulting to, by default, to a single price per tie. And CRR system will support that as well.
Okay, I'm still confused. So can we take Malin as an example? What will be the default? I'm assuming there will be D gaps at Malin for PAC West, BPA, PGE, and potentially others, since they all kind
Yeah,
of.
no, the BPA dig up will be the default location associated with Malin 500 intertie. So for all imports, exports to the ISO balancing authority area at Malin 500, the BPA dig up will be the associated gap for that tie, resulting to a single price. And even if the energy is actually not coming from within BPA in real time, as we showed in multiple presentations in the past, the participant will bridge their schedules with BPA mirror system reserves that mirrors the day-ahead schedule at Malin 500. So if it's coming from outside of BPA, let's say mid-C, for example, the participant will have an import to BPA from mid-C. Matching will be a base schedule, matching their day-ahead schedule at Malin 500 without exposure to real-time deviation price. So the BPA dig up provides sort of like a universal way to schedule imports exports at Malin 500. And the same will be true for every other ISO intertie.
Okay, I'm gonna have to still think this through. What I'm trying to think is, what if I have a resource that is in Pac West and I'm trying to buy a CRR from, Malin to bring it into the CAISO?
You can do
that's-
that. You can do that because at some point, and maybe it's not in this slide deck, but maybe it is, we said that we will support the existing scheduling points that the ISO has today as CRR sources and sinks, even when the market will be using the adjacent BAA dig up. So you will have a choice in your CRRs. You could use the adjacent BAA dig up if you want to get a hedge for your day ahead schedule, which will be from that location. Or if you only want to get a hedge for the portion of your schedule within the ISO, you can use the Malin 500 as a CRR location. So what we're stressing here is that a single tie price is going to be majorly true for the market. For the CRR system will provide more options to you. So if you want to use a hedge from Malin 500, the existing scheduling point at Malin 51 and 101, we are suggesting to continue supporting this as a potential CRR source or sink.
Okay. Thank you.
So let's go back to 15 because we didn't cover that. We covered that in questions, I think, throughout. But in terms of pricing, the starting point here is that we will be pricing the LMP at under the gap tie design based on the adjacent balancing area D gap for that particular intertie. So one price per location. This was in response to some of the stakeholder comments that we received, that there was concern that if there were multiple prices, it could lead to an opportunity for gaming in terms of what DGAP association somebody chose. But moving to one gap tie, one price based on the adjacent balancing area DGAP would address that concern. If we go to slide 16, I touched on this in response to Tom Wu's question, but consistent with the commitment that we made in the last phase when we were talking about having a forum to discuss transitioning to this design, we committed to providing analysis or data, informational advisory pricing data on the CAISO interties under the DGAP design, or for each DGAP under the gap tie design. We have finally published this on OASIS. On this slide, we provide some of the directions on how to get there, but on our OASIS page, if you go under the prices tab, then select energy prices, there should be there's a new new hovering section. It's called schedule point type combination LMPs, and you can, in that section, you can look and search, as I did here on in the graphics on the right hand side. You can search for the different DGAPs that have been established and the prices are being calculated for based on this association with the adjacent BA, adjacent balancing area. And you can compare the LMP under that DGAP design to the LMP at the actual scheduling point under today's design. And I did here just a comparison on looking at Delaney under the DGAP design and then under the existing design. At least in this example, the LMPs are practically the same. There's very small difference between them. But you can do that for your desired Intertie location. You can search by date, and you can continue looking at that and comparing. And we'll look as well in comparing just the similarity or difference in prices. And it's broken down by the different components of the LMP. And you can see there that the primary driver here is the congestion component. And especially as you look at different prices, the congestion component is the one that's affected here by the modeling changes. We did also get requests and questions or requests in prior comments on where can we find generation shift factors that inform these DGAP calculations and the contributions to congestion that some of you wanted to look at. That's public information. It's under the CAISO market participant portal. A number of you or your organizations may already have access to it. It does require a non-disclosure agreement to access this particular data, but like I said, a number of your organizations probably already have that in place, and you may be able to view it to the extent that you wanted to receive access to that. We left an email there on how you can request access to some of that information and go through the process of getting the NDA and getting the relevant login information. But this is now public and available on Oasis, and you can track as the EDAM goes on and as we have additional data that's posted on a daily basis. Let's take Tangwu's question as well.
Yes, we could please unmute.
Hi, this is Tangwu Wapa. On your screen, you have prices two locations, and they don't add up. So maybe you have another GHG row. It doesn't show. Maybe it's the GHG that's causing the difference. One is 39, the other is 23. But you look at all these components, they're all similar.
Let's see. I thought the LMP is 39 and it's 39 and the other one maybe I might have, maybe it was during the cutting process when I was
The same one?
It should be, yeah. I may have when I was cutting and pasting, I may have cut off the one
GHG?
portion of it, but could be, yeah, could be on the upper part. We can validate that, but I was just trying to illustrate that this info is available and for comparison.
Yeah, and the energy component are different. So they're in different BAAs?
The energy component looks like
one is 23, the other is 24.
Let's say this is the digger, right? That's what you're doing?
Yeah.
Pick up the line. So the marginal congestion component could be different.
Yeah.
So this line here.
Yeah.
Here
the energy. Yeah.
Losses probably different.
Yeah. The energy should be.
So losses and the marginal loss and marginal congestion component could be different because these are different locations on the grid, the dig up and the current scheduling point. But the rest should be the same.
Yeah, and I think what happened, Tong, is I did when I was cutting the image, I might have left the GHG component, but you can see the resulting LMP at least is fairly similar. So I do presume that there's a GHG component there that I left off when I was cutting the image. But the LMPs, the total LMPs based on different components here look fairly similar off by.
Okay.
So in this case, the marginal loss component is different, which is expected.
Yeah, so you can do this kind of a comparison on, looking at the different points that you're interested in. just do a search for DGAP. When you get to that list, I think you can select node, and then a box will pop up where if you type in DGAP, the list of DGAPs is going to pop up, and then you can do a
So the
selection.
difference is because of GHG. So the GHG gas component that is missing is about 16, because 39 minus 23, that's
Yeah,
16.
yeah. So the resulting LMPs look fairly similar. Yeah, I think in the cutting process, I might have
Okay.
left.
There's still GHG, marginal GHG component on the DGAP. It's not showing it. The image is
Right.
Yeah,
cutting on that line.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I cut the image maybe a little too
Yeah.
early.
So I think that's 16.
Points
That must be
comparison.
16 around.
yeah,
And-
I think you should go to Oasis and do the same comparison, Tom, and pick up maybe a more pronounced location, like you can look at Malin 500 or Palo Verde. There's a lot of transactions, so we'll give you probably a better picture to see the components, how they differ.
So the energy component are different. They're all from the same DGAP or not same DGAP.
No, the energy component should be the same. It's the ISO marginal energy cost. That one is always the same.
The energy component is based on the intertie at which location at which you're fitting.
But one is 23.144. The other one is 24.143. So they're different actually.
I see 24.143 in both.
Highlight under LMP right there.
How
Under
about the
LMP
other
code.
one? The
For another hour?
Yeah, not the same hour, the different location.
I'm looking at the highlighted, and the marginal energy cost looks the same to me. I don't see
Yeah,
difference.
so Tom Blue,
One is
you're looking at this
Chola.
one?
Chola. One is Delaney. These are 2 points, right? There's two different types. Or
Yeah, and I don't know where this one is exactly, but yeah.
but that energy is 23.144 for the other
Go ahead,
type.
Jay.
I believe they go to different BAs, Tom.
Okay.
That's why you're having different marginal energy price. Because you're having a
Okay.
separation between the Delaney, which I think is going to the ISO, and Coachella, which is going to the BAT. I don't know if that's going to Pac West. We'd have to look, but that would
Okay.
be why.
Okay. But the same DGAP. Is the same DGAP?
Same decap can have different marginal energy prices depending upon where the intertie is associated with the BAA. So this is an example would be the DGAP of BPA. If you have it going to Pac West, and then you have it going to Malin at the ISO, if the marginal energy price separates between Pac West and ISO, that DGAP tie price will have different marginal energy prices.
Okay.
Hey,
Yeah,
this is
so-
Joel. Choya is energy from APS going to PACE. So just reiterating what James just mentioned. So the LMP at PACE, it's represented by Choya,
Okay, got it. Thank you, Jamil.
or sorry, MCP.
Yeah. Okay, so telling others, this is an opportunity. It's all out there. You can compare different interties. You compare it over time and just see how similar or different the pricing may be under one design compared to the other. And as we gather more data, I think we'll be able to do that comparison even more. Okay, if we go to the next slide, I think we covered this as well in comments, but again, aligning the TRR modeling with the gap tie design for modeling intertie schedules. We recognize that if we do move to a gap tie design, that we will need to then CRRs as well to model those intertie schedule point locations and provide consistency across those, and that's where we noted all those gap tie points, source and sink locations would be supported for CRRs. As George noted, we can and we would make available if SP tie locations as well for purposes of CRR to the extent that you wanted to do Malin instead of a DGAP, as George noted for Steve. And then, to the extent that we transition to the gap time modeling, we would work on a coordinated transition as well for enhancements to the CRR modeling for those source and sink locations at the interties. Okay, let's pause here just to see if there are any more questions, because the next section is going to seek to recap the RA import discussion and how those RA imports would effectively be scheduled under different scenarios if we were to move to a gap tie design. But any more questions before we move to that RA import recap section?
Okay, look here. I'm not seeing any other hands coming in or any questions in the chat.
Okay. Sounds good. Now let's go then to the RA import into the ISO balancing area and what the scheduling would look like under a gap tie design, where now folks are associating DGAPs with those intertie locations and scheduling there. So let's go to the next slide. Just as a little bit of an overview here, that under the gap tie design, the RA showing processes do not change. Parties will continue to show RA imports of those relevant import locations where they have MIC, maximum import capability, where they're also contracted to deliver those imports. And to represent those RA imports, market participants would still need to register system resources in master file or PyGen, to the extent that these are pseudo or dynamic resources that are needed to support intertie scheduling at those locations. If we go to the next slide. So starting with, these scenarios are going to get progressively a little bit more complex, but starting with a more straightforward scenario where you have RA imports that are sourced from a non-market area. So the generator is not in an EDAM area, it's not in an EIM area, but it's in a non-market balancing area. And they'll continue to be shown, those imports will continue to be shown at the relevant intertie locations between the ISO and the non-market balancing area. The market participant, the scheduling coordinator will need, and just as today, a system resource that's established in master file, or it's a PyGen in master file associated with that DGAP of the adjacent balancing area. And then in day ahead, the bids occur at that intertie location. They're associated with the DGAP for the adjacent non-market balancing area where that generation is sourcing from. And then same thing in real time, the bid is at the intertie location associated with the DGAP for that non-market balancing area, depending on that intertie location. If that intertie is directly an intertie with the non-market balancing area, then we were using that balancing area, that adjacent balancing area as a DGAP for purposes of modeling the congestion, as well as the price formation. If we go to the next slide, just to illustrate this, and this is leveraging some of the slides from George's presentation last time, but just to illustrate it and leveraging that same information. If this is the ISO, they establish a system resource at the appropriate intertie location, and then in both day ahead and real time, the schedules continue to occur at this location along with the RA showing, and the pricing and the modeling is associated with this non-market balancing area DGAP, as we covered what the DGAP means in the last few slides. We'll go to the next slide. So we'll go to the next progressively more complicated scenario, but it's, now the RA import is sourced from an EIM balancing area. This is an EIM only balancing area. They're not in the EDAM. The RA import would continue to be shown on the intertie location between the KISO balancing area and that EIM balancing area. They would register a resource as they do today, or a system resource or a PyGen that allows them to bid at those intertie locations. And then in day ahead, because this balancing area is not in the market, it's not in the day ahead market, in the day ahead time frame, they would use that registered system resource and bid at that intertie location associated with a DGAP for the adjacent EIM balancing area where that generation is expected to be sourcing from. So they bid at that DGAP. And then in real time, and we'll illustrate this in a couple of pictures that are coming up, but in real time, the bid would be expected associated with that system resource, also at the DGAP as in the day ahead, but there would be a number of actions that the balancing areas would need to do, and the market participants, as George called it, bridging. There will be base scheduling the output of the supporting resources in the adjacent EIM balancing area, as well as at the mirror system resource, which is a function that the EIM entity performs, and they're fairly familiar with that today. So if we go to just the illustrative slides, and then George, feel free to jump in if you wanted to add anything as well. But under this first scenario, if we assume that the generation in real time is, well, in day ahead, as we noted, the bid occurs here at the system resource on the CAISO intertie, and it's associated with the DGAP of this EIM balancing area where the generation is expected to be sourcing from. In real time, if the supporting generator is G1 here that's located in that EIM balancing area, there will be a base schedule associated with that resource, and then also at the mirror system resource that occurs within that balancing area to reflect that the generation is coming from this generator and it's supporting that import into the ISO balancing area. This is a function performed by the EIM entity, but George.
Correct.
If we go one more slide, just to add another complexity to this, assume the generation now is in real time, it's not coming from this EIM balancing area A, where, you know, in day ahead, we associated that with a DGAP of the adjacent balancing area, which is the EIM balancing area A. But the generation is now in real time, it's showing up and it's coming from the supporting generator, it's coming from the EIM balancing area B, G2 here. There's additional steps, but that G2 is base scheduled. There's a transfer system resource that supports a base transfer between the EIM balancing areas, ultimately to also have a mirror system resource in the EIM balancing area A that ultimately represents the delivery and supporting delivery of that generation of G2 through EIM balancing area A to get to the CAISO balancing area. So there's additional steps if in this more complex scenario, if the generation is a couple of EIM balancing areas away, you got to get it through the EIM balancing area A, and that's done through these base transfers that are also common today in the EIM between balancing areas, and that the EIM entity performs that function. Anything you want to add, George?
No, you're covered.
Let's go to a progressively more, well, this one may be a little bit easier, but the next one will be progressively more complicated. If the RA import is sourced from an EDAM balancing area, the parties, those imports will continue to be shown at the intertie location between the ISO balancing area and the EDAM balancing area. They have the associated registered system resource that's been registered in order to have a resource ID to show that on the RA showing. Similar to what happens today, or since May, since the EDAM launch, that RA obligation then can be reassigned. So it's shown as a registered system resource in the intertie with the CAISO balancing area. But then if that generator is a physical generator in the EDAM balancing area that's supporting that RA import, they can there's a reassignment that occurs from that system resource at the intertie to that physical generator that is located in the EDAM balancing area. And again, this follows the current RA obligation reassignment process that's been in place since we launched EDAM roughly a month and a half ago. But if you're familiar with that process and you've tested the functionality and you've had some hands-on experience with this, that same process follows here. You reassign to that physical generator in the EDAM balancing area. And then in both the day-ahead market and the real-time market, the bids for the RA import obligation are now occurring at the physical generator that is located in the EDAM balancing area. You've made that reassignment to the physical generator, and you're bidding at that physical generator in both day-ahead and real-time to meet the must-offer obligation. Let's just go to one slide just to illustrate this graphically, and then we can pause for questions. I think Steve Keen has a question. But this is just an illustrative example. Again, you have a system resource. You've shown it at this intertie between the ISO and the EDAM balancing area. Now, the supporting generator is in the EDAM balancing area. You now do the reassignment of the RA obligation to the generator, G3, and then you are bidding directly in day-ahead and real-time at this generator, which is providing that RA obligation. And then there are, just as today, there's transfer system resources that are established between the CAISO and that EDAM balancing area in order to account for that generation and to contribute to the resource sufficiency evaluation. But for all intents and purposes, the bidding obligation, the must-offer obligations are fulfilled at that physical generator in the EDAM balancing area that has been as part of that reassignment of the obligation from the Intertie resource to that physical generator, because that physical generator is now supporting your contractual obligations and you're bidding at that physical generator in the EDAM BA. Let's take Steve's question.
Yeah, we could please unmute Steve Keen.
Hi, it's Steve Keen from Edison. When someone does this, do they need to provide transmission in that EDAM BAA from the generator to the tie point? Or is it just assumed that the market will deliver it from the generator to the tie point?
No, the participant needs to acquire transmission from the generator to the EDAM boundary from a transmission service provider in that EDAM BAA. Unlike the ISO, which makes new firm use available for everyone, other balancing authority areas, transmission still needs to be acquired through the existing, OSIS process or whatever.
Which Steve presumably occurs today as well, or even occurred before EDAM, to the extent that you have a generator within another balancing area. Let's say G3 is your contracted generator supporting the RA import. You eventually acquire the necessary transmission to be able to deliver that to the CAISO BA. So hopefully it's not a different obligation. The transmission still needs to be acquired eventually.
Okay, that's helpful, and I understand that. But is the CAISO actually checking to make sure that occurs? The must-offer obligation.
The must-offer obligation is part of cyber requirements. Once the array obligation has been reassigned to G3, G3 now holds the must-offer obligation to bid in the market to fill its array obligation, and this is enforced in cyber. Was that your question?
Yeah, so Steve, the market is not looking as part of your must-offer obligation. The market is not looking at your transmission. It's looking at, did you bid in that generator? Eventually, to the extent you're awarded, then there's an expectation there of you delivering it and having the transmission. But for meeting must-offer obligations, it's not looking at transmission, it's looking at your bidding.
Even before EDAM.
Yeah,
That's not a change here.
Yeah, but before EDAM, it was being bid at the intertie, right? It would be in the CAISO market, so it would be bid at the intertie. If you didn't have that transmission, then it wouldn't.
Yes,
you wouldn't assume that it would get to the intertie.
Yeah, but after the market, that participant needs to tag, and in the tag, the transmission segments in that EDAM BAA or the external BAA, whatever that is, needs to be visible in the tag, which means the participant needs to acquire transmission to be able to tag that, correct?
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't actually work in operations, so I'm trying to understand how all that works, but thank you.
You're welcome.
No, thank you, Steve, for the question. And by all means, folks, feel free to jump in as we go through any of these scenarios. I'll pause as well. The next scenario is the last one. I'll pause after that for any questions on any of the scenarios, but feel free to jump in and I'll pause at the appropriate spot and take your question. Go to the next one. This is the last scenario, as I mentioned, and this is the more, by all means, a little bit more complex scenario because, you know, it deals with the challenge of folks not knowing where the source is ahead of the day-ahead market. You know, this is a challenge that we said in the EDAM design. It's not ideal in the market that parties don't know under the contractual obligations where the source is, and we have to make some assumptions or work through some of the challenges associated with that. I'm not sure if it's permitted in other contexts, but it's certainly a feature and maybe driven by different RA programs and their obligations or requirements and what's allowed and what's not allowed. But certainly within the West, there is a number of contracts that are WSCP Schedule C or seller's choice contracts where parties may not know the source in advance of day ahead. There may be some incentives that are created by this design to know that source, but we sought a design that tried to accommodate or at least mitigate and help folks if they did not know the source prior to the day ahead market. So there's this design. If the RA import is just a contract without a fixed or known source well in advance of the day ahead market, this is going to walk through those scenarios. So the contracted import generation can continue to be shown on both the annual and the monthly RA showing at the relevant Intertie schedule location where it's delivered under the contract. It's a delivered energy at a particular Intertie that parties have under the contract. They still need MIC at that location and to be able to show it, but they would register a system resource or TIGEN master file as they do today. And based on the Intertie that they ultimately make the showing on, you know, the system resource is associated with the registration with that DGAP of the adjacent EDAM balancing area. So if you pick an Intertie location, the DGAP that's associated with it is based on that adjacent EDAM balancing area. In day ahead, if you don't know where that generation is, the day ahead market bid is at the Intertie location associated with that DGAP for that adjacent non-market balancing area. And we'll illustrate that in the examples here. And then in real time, what George usually affectionately calls bridging, in real time, once you have better information, once you know where the source of that generation is, the bidding location will vary based upon where that generation is ultimately sourcing from, whether it's sourcing from an EDAM area or EIM area or a non-market area. So let's go to the next slide that tries to illustrate this, and we can certainly take some questions. This was also discussed at the last workshop, but we wanted to spend a little bit more time on it, you know, with a little bit more context and see if there are any questions that we can answer and any settlement or related questions. But in day ahead, under this example here, we'll start with scenario 1 and then we'll move to scenario 2 and scenario 3. But under any of these scenarios, the RA showing is made at the intertie between the ISO and an EIM balancing area. That registered system resource in day ahead, you would be bidding at that intertie location with that system resource that's associated with that intertie, and it'll be priced based on the DGAP of this adjacent balancing area, which is the EIM balancing area A. If the generator under this scenario 1, if the generator in real time now, because you don't know in day ahead where this stuff is coming from, sometime after the day ahead market, or even closer to real time, hopefully it's well in advance of real time, but you've identified, your supplier has identified where that generation is coming from. If that generation supporting generator G1 is located in the EIM balancing area A here that we already had associated a D-gap with, and they had priced it at that D-gap. If that generator is located here, then you would be base scheduling that resource in real time, also the mirror system resource in real time, as sourcing from that EIM balancing area A. Similar to the scenario that we had run a few slides ago, that had assumed this as the source balancing area. If that source is this G2, similar to that EIM scenario that we had run a little bit ago, if that source is coming from G2, then you would do what we did in that example. In real time, you are base scheduling the resource, then establishing base transfers between these two EIM balancing areas. That's reflected in the mirror system resource of this balancing area A, and is ultimately being delivered to the CAISO. If that, in that scenario, if the supporting generator now in real time is sourcing from G3, which is in the EDAM, which is in an EDAM balancing area, then we would expect a real-time schedule at that physical generator. There's a transfer system resource, a real-time transfer now, because both of these are in the real-time market. They're in the EIM BAA and EDAM balancing area. Because they're in the EIM, there's a real-time transfer that occurs between that EDAM balancing area and the EIM balancing area A. And then there's a mirror system resource also that's base scheduled here in BAA that ultimately allows for delivery into the CAISO balancing area. Let me just check, George, if you wanted to highlight anything else with this particular scenario before we jump into questions.
Yeah, there's another scenario here. If the energy is actually coming from the non-EIM BAA, then the bridging is accomplished by a base import in that SR2 resource, base import from the non-EIM BAA DGAP to the EIM BAA, and that base import schedule matches the day-ahead schedule. So all these are various ways you can bridge your day-ahead schedule using the EIM BAA DGAP in the day ahead. You didn't know where the energy is coming from, but eventually in real time, you can bridge to that schedule with all these different scenarios here. And what we want to point out is that all the scenarios for G1, G2, or the input from the non-EIM BAA, you can use base schedules, and there is no exposure to the real-time deviation price, except for the scenario where the energy is actually coming from EDAM BAA, that's G3, but you didn't know that at the day-ahead market to do an array obligation reassignment, so now you have to bridge it with the EIM BAA DGAP, and for that, you need to use a dynamic transfer because there are no base transfers with EDAM BAAs. Nonetheless, you'll tag through an EIM dynamic transfer to bring it to EIM BAA, but there is a real-time settlement in this case because G3 cannot have a base schedule being part of an EDAM BAA. That will be a real-time schedule and we'll get a real-time settlement. That's what makes this case separate from the other scenarios in that slide. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, George. Yeah, let's take some questions on this one. This is a bit more of a complicated. It builds on the prior examples and adds this EDAM BA variation to the extent that, again, you don't know where stuff is coming from in time for the day-ahead market to make the reassignment or identify the more specific resource. Now, in real time, you find out better information in that generator location. So let's go take some questions.
Thanks. Yeah. So first in the queue, we have Callie Wells.
Hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. I actually just have a couple clarifying questions, and I think it's actually back on slide 27. So I just want to make sure I understand what you guys are saying here. So if I have an unknown source, or I know it's in a non-market BAA, but it's unknown, I'm going to bid at this DGAP for this adjacent non-market BAA. DGAP,
DGAP.
yes. But
Yes.
let's say I know the source, or I know it's coming from an EDAM BAA and it's going into that same intertie location, then in that case, I'm bidding at the D gap associated with that EDAM BAA. Is that correct?
Let me understand your example a little bit better. Is it any of those that we saw here?
I don't think so. Sorry, this is a lot of arrows and I was trying to follow along there. I guess what I'm trying to understand is if I have energy coming into the same intertie, let's just say it's a CAISO BAA, if the source of the energy is in that non-adjacent EDAM BAA, I'm going to use that D gap. But if the source of the energy is coming from an EDAM BAA, I'm going to use a different D gap. But both of them are going into the same intertie location. So I guess what I'm trying to
Okay.
understand is, could you have different prices now for energy importing at the same intertie location based on whether or not it's coming from an EDAM BAA or a non-EDAM BAA?
Okay, let's break it down a little bit, Callie. So first of all, if you know it's coming from an EDAM BAA, you should use the day-ahead RA obligation reassignment to bid that generator G3 directly into the market, into the day-ahead market, if you know that really that's where it's coming from.
And that scenario, we went right before that. Maybe go to slide 26.
Oh, sorry. If I don't know the exact generator, but I know it's going to come from an EDAM BAA. So it's an unknown. I don't know the exact generator. I just know it's coming from somewhere in that EDAM BAA.
I see. Okay, then let's go back to that slide. So in this case, you know it's going to come from somewhere in EDAM BAA, but you don't know which generator. You don't know generator G3 then. All right, so what we recommend here to do is to, first of all, where do you have array MIC? Because it starts from there. You have to use that particular intertie where you have MIC.
Yes, no, I understand that. Just any intertie. I'm just trying to, what I'm trying to figure out is if there's going to be different pricing for energy coming in at the same intertie.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to show you. So let's say you have MIC on that intertie from EIM BAA to the ISO that we're having the example here. So even though you know it's coming from EDAM BAA, all right, but you have a MIC on that intertie, you will show it at SR1 a month ahead, right? That's your array showing. You will bid that SR1 in the day-ahead market from the EIM BAA dig-up. You will get that price in the day-ahead market. Then in the real-time market, you bridge it from G3 real-time schedule through a dynamic transfer in real time to EIM BAA. So in real time, you will have a real-time settlement for the energy at G3. That will be in addition, that will be at the LMP of G3. So this is a different settlement from the day-ahead settlement, which was at the EIM BAA dig-up. Okay?
Yes, I think though I wasn't referring to a different price between day ahead and real time. I'm referring to different prices at that intertie location if I'm bidding both in the day ahead. So just focusing on day ahead pricing. Well, right,
yeah,
but
you'll see the same price, the EIM BAA dig-up tie price at that SR1. There's only one price.
okay, but on the previous slide, on slide
Callie?
27, you said if I am in a non-EDAM BAA, but I'm coming into the same intertie location, I use a different D gap.
Where's that?
21.
Right there under scheduling, the first sub bullet.
No, there isn't a D gap. There isn't a D gap for an EDAM BAA. So I think that's where we're having a disconnect there when it comes to scheduling this. If you don't know in that sense, you know it's coming from an EDAM BAA area. So then the question is, you're asking is how would you schedule that as SR1? Is that correct?
We can follow up offline. I don't mean to take this much airtime. I was just figuring out the pricing. So if
Yeah.
if I have energy coming from an EDAM BA into, let's just say, Palo Verde,
Mhm.
versus energy coming from a non-EDAM BA also into Palo Verde, do they get the same price?
Well,
Well,
go ahead, George.
no, I think you already answered that, James. James, he was correct when he was saying that you cannot bid at an EDAM intertie under the proposed gap tie model that we have. We have the exception for the transitional period, but outside of the transitional period, you cannot bid from the EDAM BAA D gap at that ISO intertie.
But I think what she's saying is that Palo Verde, you know, if the
It's
source,
it's
the
okay. We
source,
can follow up
ultimate source
offline.
could be,
I
Yeah.
didn't mean to take up this much airtime. I'm just trying to figure out whether or not there's going to be a single price for the same product at the same intertie
Palo
location
Verde.
under
No,
all
it will be a
scenarios.
single price. Will be a single price at the adjacent BAA D gap, because that's the one you will be using for an ISO intertie. You will not be able to use another gap like an EDAM BAA D gap with that intertie, even if you know your location for the energy comes from that EDAM BAA, because simply you cannot bid at the EDAM intertie.
Yeah. So Callie, the answer is for each intertie, there's gonna be one price based on the association with the adjacent PA. So irrespective of where your source ultimately ends up being in real time, at least for settlements for Palo Verde, those are settled at the D gap of the adjacent PA.
SRP.
SRP.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Callie. Next in the queue, we have Robert Fisher.
Hi, this is Robert Fisher from NV Energy. Can you confirm if you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Just a quick question. I think slide 26 is probably the best one. Just a quick clarification. So for G3, if the intertie for where SR3 is, if that binds, will G3 see LMP adjustment?
G3 is paid its LMP at its location. Because
So
it
there will
bids
be,
into the, yeah,
so there will be no congestion component related to any binding transmission constraint at SR3 to G3.
there could be, I mean, the transfer, what we saw here as the RSC eligible transfer could hit its scheduling limit.
Let's just assume it's just intertie binding, not TSR.
I'm sorry, the TSRs are an intertie here.
Yeah, but you can have an intertie bind and not a TSR bind.
I'm sorry, I still don't understand the
you're
question.
talking about, Robert, you're talking about the ITC and ISL binding versus the transfer constraint binding?
Correct.
Well, the ITC ISL, if it is binding, it impacts both the price of SR3 and the TSR. So when you are now using the G3 and you are using the TSRs to get the energy through to ISO, your ITC ISL binding constraint will impact the TSR price. It won't impact the G3 price.
Okay, yeah, I understand that. Let's assume there's no TSR. It's just a very basic question. If there's an ITC binding, but you allocate or you show your G3 is on that ITC and it's providing that, will it affect the LMP price? Not assuming no TSR.
No, the LMP of G3 is not affected by ITC prices. The ITC prices really affect only intertie locations. So the G3 is inside, it's an internal resource.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
what I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, there is an exception to this if you draw an ITC that encircles the entire BAA. Then that has a secondary effect that you'll see through the marginal energy cost of that BA, but you're not referring to that.
No, I'm not. I just, that's
Okay.
a very basic question. That was my question. You answered it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Robert.
We'll take these last two questions before continuing on. Next, we'll go to Tong Wu.
Tom Wu from WAPA. Let's extend this example on slide 26 a little bit. Let's say part of the RA obligation of SR3 is from a non-EIM BAA and from EIM BAA. How does that work? They say originally I have MIC between the EDAM BAA and ISO. So when I show SR3, I have MIC. But then I find out that my generator actually cannot support that. G3 cannot support it. I don't know, a month in advance. But now I know, I say, okay, I'm going to purchase from non-EIM BAA or another EIM BAA. How do I do that? Is this allowed?
It's allowed through different resources. So you can bring the previous slides where the energy is coming from an EIM BAA and have a different system resource on that intertie, which then you can bid it into the market, fulfill its RA obligation, and then bridge to it in real time. And for the MIC that you have at the EDAM intertie, you're using this SR3 to show this portion of the array obligation, and then you transfer it to G3.
Can I use the same MIC for all three sources? One is for G3, and another source is from a non-EIM BAA, and then another source from, let's say, EIM BAA.
All right.
So can I use the same MIC, or I have to get MIC from non-EIM BAA to ISO and EIM BAA to ISO separately?
Well, in our original RA proposal, where we had the ability to reassign RA obligation also in real time, you could do that and partially reassign it on G3 and partially reassign it on imports into EDAM BAA later on before real-time market. But we took that feature out because we got a feedback from participants that was too complicated, right? And that's why we have proposals here that uses the non-EIM BAA DGAP or EIM BAA DGAP to simplify this, but that will be a different intertie, so you'll need to transfer your MIC to those interties. If the MIC you have on an EDAM intertie is not fully supported by generation in that EDAM BAA, or alternatively, have additional contracts with supply in that EDAM BAA to cover your MIC.
No, I think this is very useful. This is actually, I'm not asking a fictitious, a hypothetical question. This is real. So it'll be good if you have that feature because it's very real. No, I don't think this is more complicated than the one on slide 28. That's more complicated.
Yeah, we honestly, we did have this feature. We had it in our originally proposed design that was very flexible, but it was also very complicated. It had additional array obligation reassignment that you could do in real time, and you could transfer your obligation to other resources, not necessarily in the EDAM BAA. You could go to other resources like imports into that EDAM BAA from a non-EIM BAA. So if partially your energy comes from G3 and partially, let's say, from EIM BAA, you could have a system resource import from EIM BAA to EDAM BAA to supplement the generation from G3 to meet your array requirement. And you could use the array obligation from SR3 to G3, and then to that import resource into that EDAM BAA to make the whole. And you can still do that if you do it in the day-ahead market, because we do support array obligation reassignment in the day-ahead market. It just shouldn't leave it for real time. So if I add to this,
I'm mainly concerned about day-ahead. I'm not too concerned about real time. Real time, you probably cannot do a whole lot of deal already at that time. There's too much trouble. I'm really talking about a day ahead.
Well, for day ahead, it's easy, Tom, because your array obligation reassignment, it doesn't have to be to a single resource in an EDAM BAA. You can use multiple resources. So you can have G3 and an import resource into EDAM BAA, and it could be coming from non-EIM BAA or an EIM BAA, doesn't matter. You just reassign the balance of your array obligation to that resource, and you have to bid it in the day-ahead market. That's the requirement to meet your array obligation. You bid both that G3 and the import resource to EDAM BAA, and you're golden.
Yeah. So it'd be good if you have a slide like that.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy. Yeah, it's the way I describe it. We add another system resource at the boundary, and your array obligation reassignment arrow goes to that too.
Okay, yeah, we can have another slide and just.
Yeah,
the
you
scope
can have
of
another
reassignment
slide maybe next
and-
time.
and-
So.
Yeah, scope of reassignment in day ahead and the flexibility with reassignment in day ahead. Prior
So
to the
let's
day
say,
ahead.
a month in advance, I have showing at SR3 in Sierra. And then as time close by, I know that I cannot supply that by the generator. I choose to make some purchases. And these purchases may come from a non-EIM BAA or EIM BAA, not within the EDAM BAA. If I, find a resource inside the EDAM BAA, I know there's no problem. But now it's not in the EDAM BAA. I have to go out of EDAM BAA and kind of import into the EDAM BAA first, and then import to the ISO. That would be the scenario.
That is correct, Tom. You just need to have that import system resource registered to be able to do an array obligation reassignment to
Okay.
it. It cannot be an intertie transaction. But of course, you also know that EDAM BAA, so far, they don't support intertie transactions anyway. Like Pacifico requires all intertie resources to be registered. So you just have to have one register for that purpose, okay?
So it'll be good if you have like a slide the next time.
Yeah, we'll
just
have
talking
one.
about it, it's like I kind of understand, but it would be good to have a slide to go through the
Sure.
mechanism and details.
Will do.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, thanks.
Next, we'll go to Steve Keen.
Hi, Steve Keen from Edison again. Can we go to slide, I think it's 28, the more complicated example? And what I'm trying to understand is the G3 on this one. And this kind of gets to the previous question that I asked about having to show transmission. I'm assuming that, when I bridge with the G3 in the real-time market, I would have to have transmission from that EDAM or within that EDAM BAA to the transfer point with the CAISO. But it looks
Not
like
with
in
the
this
CAISO.
example,
Not with the CAISO. You need transmission from a TSP in the EDAM BAA to get from G3 to the boundary. Then you need transmission to have, actually, the EDAM BAA could allocate transmission to an economic transfer in real time, which you will tag through it. But then you also need transmission in EIM BAA to reach the boundary of EIM BAA as well. So you need all these transmission legs that you will put in the tag when you tag your schedule. No, it's not
That's
different
even
than
if-
today, Steve. Today
Okay,
you'll
I'm
need
just
to
trying-
acquire that transmission as well.
I get that, but I'm thinking, I'm trying to assume, this is at Malin. So I put a resource in at Malin, but then I'm actually going to supply it from a generator in PAC, which is in EDAM. Are you telling me that
Yes.
I can't just go from PAC into the CAISO, I have to go from PAC to BPA, through BPA, and then in?
Yes, because you have a day ahead schedule from BPA to ISO. If you do a day ahead array obligation reassignment to G3 from your system resource, then you can bid G3 in the day ahead and tag through an EDAM transfer between the EDAM-BA and the ISO BAA. This is what we saw in another slide. But here, this one addresses the case where the array source is unknown, and you find out that it's coming from G3, an EDAM resource, after the day-ahead market has run. So now your options are limited, and they have to go through bridging your day-ahead schedule, wherever that is. In this case, it's at the SR1. If you want to do something different than that, you have to buy back your schedule at SR1, and we don't recommend that, because that will be, if you don't tag SR1 real time, that's subject to hasp reversal. And of course, you're also going to have rain, because that SR1 is where you meet your array obligation. If you buy it back, you didn't fulfill your array, even if you generate from G3. Our system doesn't substitute between SR1 and G3. It doesn't have that information. It's also not supported under the array substitution rule.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And I see one final hand from Carrie Bentley before we move on. Go ahead, Carrie.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I have a request for the next stakeholder meeting, and that's to do what you did similarly last time and to create a table with this information. I appreciate talking through it in the pictures, and I hope next time we could have a comparison table and it has the different scenarios laid out. And then in that table specifically show whether the resource must economically offer or is able to economically offer, or whether it must self-schedule. It's complicated enough to track all the scenarios going through this, but then one thing we're not talking about is the difference today between economic offers and self-scheduling at the ties, and how that changes under these different scenarios. So Tong likes the math. I like the table, and I hope you consider it. Thank you.
Sounds good, Carrie. Yeah, we can do a table next time. And I think that will fit well with the topic that we'll cover next time as well, which is intertie scheduling at EDAM, internal intertie. So we'll do that. Okay, I don't see any more questions. Anything in the chat, Christina?
I'm not seeing anything else coming in.
Okay. All right, 3 o'clock, 3:05. I give permission to folks, if this is virtual, if you need to take a break or you get some food, but I think for the sake of time, we're gonna continue with this discussion and shift this to George to talk a little bit about a concept and a situations that we're running into where we're considering enhanced schedule limit constraints. We thought that this is because we're talking about intertie schedule modeling enhancements, that this is a topic that fit well here to introduce with stakeholders, as it involves modeling evolution of schedule limit constraints at certain interties. And we'll certainly, this is one of the areas we'll be asking for comment on and your perspectives on this potential
click the down
design.
Yes.
So George, I'll turn it over to you.
Christina, thank you, Milos. It's okay. I have a longer arm. Okay, hello everyone. So I was hoping we'll have some time for a break, but we're going to go breakless. This is a new topic for all of you. So let's go through it. So I want to talk to you a little bit as an introduction about the transmission constraints that we enforce in our markets. And you probably have heard this from me before. We have two types of transmission constraints. We have the power flow constraints. Sometimes we refer to these as physical constraints. And these are power flow or our ampere type constraints on transmission branches and branch groups. And they affect all resources except transfers, notably based on resource shift factor to power flow constraints. For sure, you're familiar with these constraints. They give rise to the marginal congestion component of the LMP for all resources. Again, transfers are exception. And then we have the other set of transmission constraints. These are scheduling constraints. These apply only on interties, and they affect only intertie resources, and that includes imports, exports, and transfers. All right. And similar effect, they affect those intertie resources based on schedule contributions. This is the equivalent of a shift factor to the scheduling constraint, but in this case, the contributions are 1, 0, or -1. By convention, scheduling limits have a positive limit for import, negative for exports that are algebraic. So imports contribute with a factor of 1, exports with a factor of -1, and that's only if those locations are associated with a specific scheduling constraint. Otherwise, there's no impact. For example, Palo Verde constraints do not have an impact on Malin 500 intertie schedule. Okay. In our master file, maintain associations between any scheduling constraint and the locations that are bound by it, so that we know what these schedule contributions are for each intertie resource and scheduling constraint. Now, why are we bringing this up to you? Some of our scheduling limits, they have an inaccurate modeling, okay? And that results in violating transmission rights that the ISO has outside the ISO balancing authority area. They're still part of the ISO control grid, which extends the ISO balancing authority area using those rights that have been turned to the ISO and they're released as new for all participants. That unfortunately leads to real-time schedule curtailment and sometimes financial penalties if the violation is not removed because we overschedule our rights. So we want to do something about this. This is an old issue. It's an MRTU issue. We're coping through this since the MRTU. So you may ask, why you bring it now for a potential solution? And the reason is that now we're expanding our market. It's not only the ISO balancing authority area in the day-ahead market. Now we have other BAAs that are joining EDAM. We want to have an accurate modeling of our scheduling limits so that we don't affect their participation in the day-ahead market. And also their participation in the day-ahead market makes this problem a lot more pronounced because we have a lot more dynamic schedules and transfers that going through those scheduling limits, it's becoming, as I will show you next, hard to manage. So first, let's discuss what kind of scheduling limits we have, because we don't have this problem with all the scheduling limits. You're familiar with what we call the intertie scheduling limit, or ISL. These are scheduling limits that constrain all the schedules that are tagged on a specific intertie or a group of interties, as I show here, ISL1 and ISL2. And it could be, in theory, multiple scheduling points that are using that intertie, but in reality, all our scheduling points currently are associated one-to-one with an intertie, so that's not the case. It's always one SPTie that has this ISL. A prominent example is Malin 500. It has an ISL limit that applies to everything that goes through Malin 500, imports, exports, and transfer. We have no problem with those. The other kind of scheduling limits, we call them intertie transmission constraints. This is a generalization of the ISL. And for some of them that they don't involve rights on external network, we don't have a problem with those either. But some of them, there are limit schedules at one or multiple scheduling points that are tagged on a single or multiple transmission segments between the scheduling points, which are outside the ISO balancing authority area. And these take the form of concentric, if I can call them like that, hierarchical constraints, as this picture shows. And for example, ITC1 here constrains all imports, exports at scheduling point 1. And ITC5 constrains all imports, exports at scheduling point 1 and scheduling point 2. Then ITC6 constrains all imports, exports at SP1, SP2, and SP4. And finally, ITC7 constrains all imports and exports on all these 4 scheduling points. Now, we'll be using this simplified example here to discuss the issues and the solution. In reality, we do have more complicated ITC systems in the southern participating transmission owner rights that have been turned to the ISO to make them available for everybody as uniform use. As you can see, there are multiple constraints constraining multiple scheduling points. Never mind that, forget that picture. We'll work with our simplified diagram here. And the question that may come to mind is, okay, how is the ISO calculating the scheduling limits for these complex constraints? Well, for every ISL and normal ITC, the limit reflects the operational transfer capability on that intertie, considering simultaneous power transfer capability and contingency limitations. In other words, it's an operational / reliability limit. But for these specific ITCs that are on the ISO control grid, reflecting transmission rights outside of the ISO balancing authority area, those ITCs which are nested, the way I described before, they reflect transmission rights on the transmission segments outside the ISO. These are the blue numbers in our example here that essentially state the rights that are available for participants to use on this network for imports and exports to from the ISO and also well through these points. So once we have our rights, how the ITC limit is calculated, it's simply we sum up the rights of all segments that the ITC intersects. So for ITC 1, that constrains all imports exports at SP1, you have a segment from 1 to 2 for 100 megawatt rights, and one from 1 to 3 for 150 megawatt rights. So the total scheduling limit for ITC1 is 250 megawatts. ITC2 also 250 megawatts. ITC3 is 450 megawatts because you have two segments, 1 to 3, 150, and 3 to the ISO for 300. And similarly, ITC4 is 650 megawatts. ITC5, 300 megawatts, because it's cutting 250 megawatt rights. ITC6, 650 megawatts, and ITC7, 800 megawatts. Now, there is an assumption in the calculation of these rights, and this is the important thing to state here, is that the assumption is that these intertie schedules that clear these constraints, they are optimally tagged, stress on optimally, to accommodate the maximum volume of net import or exports of the associated SPs. So in English, you may have imports exports at SP1. Let's say you have a net import at SP1 that clears the market based on the ITC limit of 250 megawatts. There is an assumption there that 100 megawatts out of those 250 that cleared are going to be scheduled, tagged on the left path from SP1 to SP2 to SP4 to the ISO, and 150 megawatts will be tagged on the other path, on the rightmost path, from SP1 to SP3 to ISO, and therefore this way we can accommodate a total of 250 megawatts net import at SP1, everything else not being in the present. Just have that one. Unfortunately, this assumption does not always hold because the tags are not always made in some optimal way. The market cannot today, with the information it has, to tell you how to tag so that you have feasible schedules. The tags are not even known to the market, and sometimes the participants, when they participate in the day-ahead market, the tags are not ready yet. They're submitted after the day-ahead market. So the assumption does not always hold, and that results in transmission right violations and financial penalties when we violate our rights. And this is a problem, as I said, we're coping with since MRTU, but lately there is a lot of market activity that's coming our way with the opening of EDAM and additional BAs participating. Dynamic transfers will exacerbate this problem. And one example is when SRP joined our EIM, we had to block the ISO SRP transfer because it was causing violation of our rights. This may get worse when LADWP joins EDAM and more generally when other BAAs join EDAM. So it's something that has come to the top of our list here for enhancements to solve it. And as Milos mentioned, we thought it's appropriate to bring it to you in the context of this Intertie scheduling evolution initiative, because this is an evolution for our scheduling limits. So to understand what the proposed solution is, we need to explain what is currently happening with the ITCs. So we'll use our example here. As I mentioned, we have a one-to-one SP-TIE association. And the scheduling point, the scheduling path is shown on the tag because when you tag, you have to use all the intermediate transmission legs. But the market doesn't know about it, so it does not impact the market solution. So the ITCs, the way they're enforced, they don't look at scheduling path. They use those, they constrain the, the net import-export at the associated scheduling points. So to illustrate that with an example, we add some bids here, some import-export bids. So you use two import bids at SP1, I1 and I2, two export bids at SP2, E1 and E2, and a wheel-through schedule from SP3 to SP4. A wheel-through construct in cyber is an import and an export tied together and associated as a group. And there is a constraint formulated in the market that keeps the import and export leg in balance. That's a wheeling construct. So this is a wheel-through that uses rights outside of the ISO balancing authority area. It doesn't even go through the ISO balancing authority area, but it goes through the ISO control grid. So this is our example. And in the current system, the market doesn't know how I1 and I2 are going to be tagged. All it sees is that they're scheduled at the same scheduling point SP1. So for each of these bids, we can calculate or we can determine the ITC coefficients by, the market does it by the association of ITC to scheduling points, which is in the master file. Here we can do it by just looking at the diagram. So I1 and I2, the imports at SP1, they're obviously constrained by ITC1, ITC5, ITC6, and ITC7, right? Because you can see those ITCs are enclosing SP1. So the ITC coefficients are 1, because these are imports for those ITCs, and the same for import 2. As far as the market is concerned, I1 and I2, they are identical, they have identical impact on the ITCs. The same with exports, export 1 and export 2. They're constrained by ITC2, ITC5, 6, and 7, but we're using -1 as coefficients because these are exports. They're going the opposite direction. And for the import leg of the wheel-through at SP3, that is constrained by ITC3 and ITC7, whereas the export leg is constrained by ITC4, ITC6, and ITC7. Once we have that information, and the market deciphers that information by the master file association of ITC to scheduling points, we can see how this example plays out by putting in some bids. So let's say import 1 is 150 megawatt at $10, etc. We put some values for import 2, export 1, and export 2, and the wheel-through. For wheel-through, the quantity has to be the same because it's kept in balance, right? So even the bid has to be the same capacity on each side. And let's say that the marginal price is set by some internal generator in the ISO, which is marginal, let's say at $30. So with the marginal energy cost of $30, all these bids are in the money. Remember, exports are above the marginal energy cost, the imports below the marginal energy cost. So you want to take all of these bids. So if we could clear all the schedules, and the optimal schedule would be what they bid, the maximum bid, then with the contributions to the ITCs from the previous table that I showed you, the 1 minus 1, we can figure out, the market can figure out the schedule contribution to those ITCs. All right, so ITC 1, so import 1 has 150 megawatt contribution to ITC 1, 5, 6, and 7. So this is, we do this for all bids that we have in the market. We tally them up vertically to see the total use of each ITC. And the scheduling limit that we calculate for the ITCs is in the purple row here. So you can see that although ITC 1 is tight, no ITC is violated. So it is optimal to clear all these bids in the market. So remember this, in this example using the ITCs, all of the schedules are feasible and will clear the market, okay? Irrespective of how they're gonna be tagged, and that's the important thing. The market doesn't know how they're gonna be tagged, so today it's gonna clear them all, it says everything is good. All right, now we want to introduce a new piece of information to the market, which is what will be the scheduling path that will be used for its intertie schedule. The scheduling path, you can consider it as a composite intertie. So it's still an intertie, but internally in the master file, there is an association of its scheduling path with a series of transmission segments between the scheduling points or the ISO. So that is a scheduling path. It's a composite intertie. That can be used to schedule and tag imports from a scheduling point to ISO, or exports from ISO to a scheduling point, or, as we saw in the example, will through between scheduling points. And each transmission segment in the scheduling path has a scheduling limit per direction in general, so it's a directional limit, but in our simple example here, to illustrate the concept at a high level, we assume that the scheduling limit is the same for its direction to simplify things. And externally, so that we don't impact scheduling and pricing existing systems of market participants, we'll define its scheduling path as an intertie. So for the external world, it will look like an intertie like any other intertie. And actually, it could generally be applied to every intertie because, in general, an intertie could have a single transmission segment. So it's still a scheduling path, okay? It's still a composite intertie of 1. So it's a general system that you can represent all interties with the additional information of the transmission segments that are this intertie is composed of. Now, this is very important to define the scheduling path as an intertie, because there will be a transparent change to the SP tie and the gap tie model, and also the SP tie and gap tie price, because the market will still be using the SP tie. And then when I say SP tie, the gap tie is just another SP tie. The gap is an aggregate SP. So I use this interchangeably because it's the same concept from a system standpoint. So using scheduling paths, we won't have an impact in either scheduling or settlement, because the scheduling still will be on an SP tie. The settlement will still use an SP tie price. And of course, there's not going to be a change in tagging, because tagging today already uses those segments, those transmission segments on the scheduling path. So there will be no impact on that. So using the scheduling path and going back to our example here, we'll try to apply it with more information supplying to the market to do a better job than the existing ITCs. So we have the same example here. And first of all, we have to register all relevant scheduling paths as unique SP ties. And then associate each SP tie with the transmission segments that are used for tagging. So we have here 5 transmission segments. Mnemonically, I use a naming convention here that shows the SPs at each end of the segment. So S1, S2 is from SP1 to SP2. That's 100 megawatt limit, reflecting the 100 megawatt rights that we have. Then there is S1, S3 for 150, S2, S4 for 150. S3, S0, I'm using S0 for the ISO, again, as a naming convention here for our example, that's 300 megawatts. And S4, S0 for 500 megawatts, these are all the segments we have. And then we define the SP ties to accommodate our bids. It's an SP slash a tie. So the composite tie, I use again a naming convention that uses all the intermediate and edge scheduling points. So one SP tie is using here S1, S2, S4, S0. So this is the left scheduling path from SP1 to the ISO. That uses segments S1, S2, S2, S4, and S4, S0. And then we define the other SP tie using the right path, which is S1, S3, S0, that uses segments S1, S3, and S3, S0. So we do that for all the SP ties that we have in our example being used by the bids, which we add them here, same as before. But now we shake things up a little bit. We say import one is using the left scheduling path, S1, S2, S4, S0. So it has contributions to S1, S2, S2, S4, and S4, S0. Import two, the existing ITC won't see the difference between import one and import two, but here, import two is a system resource registered in the master file at a different SP tie. Same scheduling point, SP1, but it's using a different tie. It's using the left scheduling path, S1, S3, S0. And therefore it has contributions on S1, S3, and S3, S0. So you can see the difference now between import one and import two. They have different contributions to our constraints, which are on the transmission segment. Same for export one and export two at SP2. Export one is using the left scheduling path. Again, we're using -1 for the contributions because it's an export. Export two, the right scheduling path. The import leg of the wheeling is using S3, S1, S2, S4. All right, because it goes from S3 to S1 through S2 out from SP4. So it's using S1, S2, S2, S4, and S1, S3. We're using once for the import. The export SP tie, the scheduling point is SP4, that's the exit point, but it's the same tie, the same scheduling path from S3, S1, S2, S4. Note there that we don't put -1 on the scheduling segments, on the transmission segments of that path for the export on the wheel-through construct. That is very important because we already cut the contribution to the segments from the import leg. If I add the export leg with -1s, I will cancel it out. All right, so for wheeling, we only put in the transmission segment coefficient for the import leg. The export leg does not have contribution because the contribution is already captured by the import leg. So same as before, we use this table and our bids, same bids as before, to find the contributions to the segments based on that table with the segment contribution factors. Again, with a $30 marginal energy cost, all these bids are in the money. So the market would like to schedule them all at their maximum. And if it does so, and we calculate the segment contributions, okay? So the first one, import one, is using the left path. So it's using S1, S2, S2, S4, and S4, S0. 150 megawatt contributions to that. You can see import two is using the other path. So it has contributions to S1, S3, and S3, S0 for 100 megawatts. We do the same for everything else. Remember, the export leg does not have contributions because we capture it at the import leg of the wheel-through. Now, if we add this vertically, you'll see that the same bids that the ITC system today will clear for the market, they're infeasible. So they violate our rights on S1, S2, and S2, S4 because the contributions exceed the scheduling limit on those rights. So what the market did before using the ITC is it didn't know the scheduling path, so it cleared those schedules because they simply cleared the ITC. But the ITC, as we mentioned, the way it's modeled is inaccurate. So that's why we have the phenomenon where even though a set of schedules clear the market today, they may still result in transmission violations that we need to cope with in real time. So here, though, the market has information about the scheduling path. We added that information in the system. So now it can actually perform congestion management on these bids so that we don't violate the scheduling limits. All right, so we'll look at here. This is the biggest violation. Import 2 is not affected. The exports provide counterflow anyway, so both import 2 and the exports are going to be scheduled at their maximum. And then we have to do congestion management between the wheel through and import 1. Looking at the bids, import 1 is bidding 10 for meeting load at the ISO at 30. It's a $20 benefit. You look at the wheel through from 5 to 65, it's $60 implicit bid on transmission, so that's more valuable. So the wheel through will win here, and we'll have to cut import 1. Since we violate by 100 megawatts, we have to cut 100 megawatts for import 1. So the result of congestion management that the market will now do, it will reduce import 1 to 50 megawatts. We show here the $30 marginal energy cost, which is set by some marginal ISO generator. And since the bid for import 1 is at $10 and we cut this, that means that the saddle price for this constraint on S1, S2 that is binding at 100 megawatts is the difference between the bid and the MEC. So it's a $20 saddle price. So this is the saddle price for the congestion, for the scheduling congestion on segment S1, S2. This is seen by the LMPs for all the SP ties that are using S1, S2. So it is seen by import 1. So import 1 LMPs are $10. Okay, it's marginal. Import 2 and export 1, they don't see this congestion, so they get the $30 price, the MEC, set by the ISO generator at the margin. Export 2, it says that price, provides a counterflow, so it's a $10. That's a benefit for an export because it's paying less than its bid, right? And then it's also seen by the wheel through because the import leg is priced at $10, seeing that saddle price, the effect of the congestion. The export, of course, is getting the $30 price because we said there's no contribution. We captured it here. So there's a $20 congestion cost for the import 1, export 2, and the wheel through. That's the result of congestion management. You see the effect on the LMP. Note that both import 1 and import 2 are at the scheduling point 1, yet they have different LMPs because they're actually different SP ties. You still have a single price per SP tie. So even if the scheduling point is the same, the SP tie is different because those imports have a different scheduling path. So the market, with the additional information of the scheduling path, can perform congestion management accurately and enforce our transmission rights without violation.
George, real quick before we continue, we have 2 hands raised on the previous slide.
Yeah, let's do that.
So if you, here, I can go back. First, we'll go to Carrie Bentley.
Thank you. Yes, Carrie.
Hi, George. I'm sorry. I'm really lost. Can you just explain what you're doing, maybe very simply? Like, Today, the prices on the interties, and I assume you're only talking about CAISO to non-EDAM interties, are set in this way. Tomorrow, we are proposing to do, and then explain your proposal.
Yeah, so currently we have the situation for these ISO interties, specifically for the Southern Participating Transmission Ownership. There are a few other locations, but they really affect only ISO interties that we have these complicated ITCs. I haven't seen a similar ITCs for EDAM or EIM BAs, but I don't preclude the possibility that we may run into the situation for other BAAs, but it's principally an ISO issue today.
Yes,
maybe to
so, but can you please say, so I get it, it's an issue today, primarily in the South, and I followed you up to that point. Where I'm having trouble is, what are you proposing? A new way of doing intertie pricing, an additional congestion component? Are you, I don't quite get, I don't get it.
No, it's a fair question. So the proposal is to replace the existing ITCs that we have with a general system that is using interties that have an association with transmission segments, and the constraints, the scheduling limit constraints, are enforced on the transmission segments for the specific SP tie. So you still have an SP tie price the same way like we have today, but the contribution to that SP tie does not come from scheduling limits from an ITC, but it comes from saddle prices on enforced binding constraints on any of the segments that are used in that SP tie. So in this case, segment S1, S2 is constrained and it has a saddle price. So instead of having some ITC saddle price factoring into the marginal congestion component of the import LMP, you have a similar situation where the saddle price of that specific segment factors into the marginal congestion component of that LMP for that import.
Gotcha. So to repeat that back, you are changing the methodology of the congestion component for all interties, or a specific set that you're concerned about?
So the methodology does not change. The methodology is still the same. Any binding transmission constraint has a saddle price which contributes to the marginal congestion component of the resource that is constrained by it. In the existing system, that could be an ITC saddle price. We replace that with a transmission segment saddle price. So the methodology is the same. All right? You still have an SP tie to use for scheduling. You still have an SP tie price for the settlement. That SP tie price still has contributions from binding scheduling limits. Today, it has contributions from binding ITCs. This system replaces these contributions from binding transmission segments. So still the same methodology. We still arrive at an SP tie price. The mechanics may be a little different. Instead of using the existing ITCs, we replace these constraints with transmission segment constraints. They contribute the same way to the LMPs.
I see. And the goal is to more accurately price the underlying constraints, or
correct, because the real scheduling limit is on the transmission segment where we have the rights. That's what we want to enforce. The ITCs try to do that the way I displayed here by adding up all the rights on the segments that they cut through, but that is insufficient. That ends up with not an accurate way of enforcing our rights, resulting in violations. Whereas this one, this method, without changing externally anything for market participants, and don't get me wrong, we have to do work internally for this, but externally, you're still using SP ties to register your resources, to bid these resources, and to get settled on these resources with the SP tie price for each SP tie that you're using. But internally, our system will decipher the impact of any intertie schedule that it has on the intermediate transmission segments based on our mapping in the master file, will enforce the constraints, the scheduling limits on each transmission segment, and will end up with feasible schedules that will not violate our rights and still produce an SPTI price for settlement.
Does this require everyone to know their path ahead of time? Or when you say mapping, are you going to assume some sort of mapping in the CAISO files?
So when you register resources today, system resources say, you register them at a specific SPTI. The same is here. The import one is registered at this SPTI that's using this scheduling path. Import two is using a different SPTI. It's registered at a different SPTI using this scheduling path. So it's not different than today. You still have to register resources, and you have to register resources at a specific SPTI. And of course, it also works with intertie transactions. The SPTI is part of the intertie transaction bid in cyber. So again, you have to declare, same as today, you have to declare which SPTI you're using. But the SPTI you're using with this system, internally, the system knows the scheduling path by the definition of the SPTI and the association that it has with transmission segments. But you still have to know which SPTI to use to register your resources. And then very importantly, you will tag your schedule after the market in consistency with that particular scheduling path. So import one here clears at 50 megawatts. You will submit a tag for 50 megawatts after the day ahead market using these transmission segments, S1, S2, S2, S4, and S4, S0, because that's your market schedule. That's not different than today. You still have to tag, you're showing the transmission segments, but now the transmission segments that you show in your tag will have to agree with your market schedule, right?
And maybe just to add to what George said, Carrie, and correct me if I'm wrong, George, but just to more directly answer her question, I think you could register multiple system resources, identifying different paths. At the time of registration, you don't need the transmission, right? The transmission only comes in after you're awarded, and you have to tag depending upon which system resource you're using. But
yeah, in fact, the transmission is free at the ISO. It's all new for use. You still need transmission to get to SP1. So you can have two resources registered at SP1, both import one and import two. You're using two different scheduling paths, right? And you can both bid them in the market and see what clears, but you have to be careful here, okay? Because you have to tag what clears. So if you have both of them bid in the market and they both clear, you have to tag both. So you must have transmission to get to SP1 for the combined 150 megawatts in this case, okay?
I understand what you're proposing now. Thank you, George. That was a very helpful clarification.
And maybe, George, if we can just add as well, and I think you highlighted this, but it's important to note that this does not apply to every intertie. There's a set of interties, and how would you differentiate it, George? Do they have different segments?
No, they have, in general, interties may have only a single segment, so it doesn't really matter. It is what
Mullen
it
is one of those, luckily, who has a single
Mullen
segment. So it doesn't
500
apply to Mullen.
There's only one segment, so the scheduling path is known. You don't have to select.
But there may be, and George, on slide 32 of the broader deck, that the slide of this primarily, at least, the effect is on those southern participating transition owner rights, where there are down there in the south multiple segments that have made it challenging to operationally manage the impacts. So what George is suggesting or proposing is a different way of managing those impacts, but it applies to those paths that have multiple segments, which is not every intertie. It's predominantly across the southern part of the system where there may be an impact.
Right, and looking at that big picture, Carrie, that doesn't mean that we have to define every possible combination of scheduling point and scheduling path, only the ones that are actually used by market participants, which we know from the tags that we receive. And if a market participant wants to register a resource with a specific scheduling path, we'll make it available, but it doesn't have to be an exhaustive process. This be one?
Just illustrate this one, the southern participating.
Oh, the big one?
Yeah, just so they can see at least, it's certain interties, it doesn't apply everywhere on the
Yeah,
system.
you can see this and then please unsee it. So this is what we're dealing with, okay? This is the most complicated scenario that we have. There are some other smaller ones, but yeah, essentially here you have a bunch of scheduling points. Some of them could become transfer locations too, which, you know, that's why we want to have a system that properly enforces our rights, because transfers are optimized, right? And in real time, every 5 minutes. So without having an accurate system for enforcing our rights, it's going to be extremely onerous for operations to manage this, and for us at the ISO side to make sure we manage our rights properly and not have transmission violations, schedule cuts, and financial penalties. Okay, they want to unseat this, so please take it off.
And we have a couple more questions. First, we'll go to Alan Meck and then to Tongwu. Please keep your questions brief since we are running short on time.
Yeah, go to slide 11 maybe, because still. Okay.
Hi, Alan Meck, PG&E. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. So help me understand a little bit about how this process is going to work from a bid to scheduling standpoint. So if we go back, can you go back to the slide that you're showing?
This one here, where we have the setup?
That one, yes, this
Okay.
one. So let's say that I'm a BA that has sold a resource at SP1 that has sold RA to California. And so I think the way you're saying is the BA would still bid at SP1 as per usual. And then what you're talking about is just a slightly different mechanism for calculating and clearing the constraints more efficiently, right? That's like path specific.
Yes, for RA, you're jumping a little bit ahead of my slide next, but you will be using a register system resource to show your array. That register system resource, part of its registration, you will use a tie. So it could be import one using this tie here, S1, S2, S4, S0, or import two using S1, S3, S0. All right, these are different mix now. I was going to cover that next. So that doesn't change the way we are doing array. You're still using a system resource. You register it, you have make on it, and then you bid it.
I see.
So you're correct for all this.
So when you go to register your resource, you would register it with the transmission path that you either own or anticipate to be able to acquire if need be.
Correct. Same as today, when you register an Intertie resource, you have to register its SPTie. So you have to tell to the master file which SPTie you're using for that resource. No different than today, but there may be different options, like for an import at SP1, here we're showing two different ties. Potentially, these are two different resources that you can register at SP1, okay?
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that you've avoided a situation where you own transmission on one leg and get transmission and get an award going the other direction to get to CAISO. It sounds like you've thought about that.
Okay, yeah. So all of this transmission between these points, all these blue numbers you see here, this is new for use, available to everybody to use, right? You still need transmission to get to SP1, right? Of course, but that doesn't matter what scheduling path you're going to use from SP1. You need to secure transmission to get to SP1, and then you use the resource with either the left or the right scheduling path to bid it and clear the market, and then you tag it, okay, based on what cleared the market.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I'm seeing one more hand from Tongwu, and Tong, if you can keep it brief so that we have time to get to George's last two slides.
Yeah, let me keep it. This is Tom Wu from WAPA. George, you know, I have a kind of understanding of what you said. You can confirm whether my understanding is correct or not. It seems you just set a limit at each path. It's just like a normal that you do for each branch, you have a limit. The only difference is now here, instead of using a power transfer distribution matrix, because you don't have impedance, you cannot have that. You're going to replace that with 1, 0, or -1. Basically, you have an incidence matrix to replace that PDTF in your formulation. Is that right?
You are correct.
Okay.
You are correct. This is similar to the ITCs. The ITCs have a similar table,
Right.
but now
Yeah.
we translate the ITCs to segments, so it's the same 1, 0, -1.
Right, right. It's just you don't have the impedance. You cannot calculate PDDF. You just gave the 1 or 0. But now the question is
correct.
now if you have these injections, are you identified this to their own right, or this is all the transmission you're talking about is available to everybody? It's ISOs and new firm use. There's no transmission rights here.
Okay, let me expand a little bit on this. Of course, there is new firm use that is made available for everybody, but it is quite possible that some scheduling coordinators, some participants may have also legacy transmission rights. For example, a scheduling coordinator may have legacy transmission rights to come from SP2 through SP4 to the ISO. That doesn't change anything. It's just that this participant, if they decide to exercise their rights, they will sub-schedule their import. Let's say it's import
Right.
2.
So do you exclude others from using that in this methodology?
Well, I wouldn't say exclude, but because the self-schedule has a higher scheduling priority than other self-schedules and bids, you can say that self-schedule will clear ahead of others.
Yep, thanks.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Tom. And I'm not seeing any other slides at this time, so I think we can continue.
All right, so as I mentioned before, there is no change in tagging because today's tags, they still show the transmission segments. This is already in place. You're using it today. But what I mentioned that is important after the day-ahead market, the tag must be consistent with the SPTI schedule that cleared the market. Inconsistent tags, like today, if you have an inconsistent tag, will be rejected, leading to a hash reversal. So always tag inconsistency with your SPTI schedule. You already have your day-ahead settlement. That doesn't affect anything. You tag the right way. There is, though, a set of some market participants, they do have what we call alternate intertie agreements. So we will honor those and we will support an alternate scheduling path, which is registered in the master file for the specific resource. So the scheduling coordinator may request tagging on an alternate scheduling path after the day-ahead market. We will honor this request and will accommodate them on a first-come, first-served basis if the change does not violate transmission segment scheduling limits. So in our example, import 2 cleared the market because it was using segments that they were not constrained. If it comes back and has an alternate scheduling agreement to use the left path, we won't be able to accommodate this because the left path was constrained. S1, S2 was binding, right? So if we can accommodate it, it will go in. There's no change in the day-ahead market settlement. That's a change in the books. And it will persist through the real-time market. So we'll support existing alternate intertie agreements. We're not abrogating any agreements with this. This is fully compatible with all models that we're proposing. It's compatible with the gap tie, with RA and CRR compatibility. So this is the existing, the enhanced scheduling limit constraints, okay? Why it's compatible with the gap tie model? Because even when you move the SPs that I was using in the example to gaps, the adjacent BAA D gap, it's still a gap tie. It doesn't change anything. The generation aggregation point is just an aggregate scheduling point. So whatever we said about SP ties applies to gap ties. So you'll have a gap tie where the tie is a composite tie. That's all it is. No impact on array showing because you're still show array on the system resource that is scheduling on that specific SP tie. You can still perform array obligation before the day-ahead market and take it out from that SP tie to some EDAM BAA resource that is using that particular scheduling path to tag. So no impact on participants' systems. There will be an impact on CIRA on how the MIC is validated and awarded, because now the MIC will be on specific tie. So obviously the scheduling path that represent the tie, CERA will have to make sure that the combined mix do not violate our transmission rights. It's going to be on us. We'll have to handle that. But for the participant, they can still request and get MIG on any SP tie. For CRRs, obviously there has to be a similar enhancement to support the ESLC, the enhanced scheduling limit constraints, as a replacement of the existing ITCs, right? In the CRR SFT and the CRR 1B. So CRR nomination and auction will enforce scheduling limits on transmission segments, same as the market, for consistency and full alignment. This is clear, it has to be the same. And all ISO SP ties used in the market will be available CRR source sync, as we said that before. Even with these composite ties, the same thing happens. They're all going to be available as CRR source and sync. And CRR 1B, although internally will change to use the ESLC and not the ITCs, fundamentally will do exactly the same thing as today. Will pay CRRs using binding transmission segment scheduling constraints in proportion to the schedule contributions. So like today, CRR 1B, if there are CRRs that are using a specific ITC and that ITC is constrained, and we don't collect enough congestion revenue from that ITC to pay those CRRs, we pay them pro rata. Same here. If there is a transmission segment binding, we collect congestion rent on it. If that is not sufficient to pay all the CRRs that are using scheduling paths that go through that scheduling segment, then we'll pay them pro rata, same way. So fundamentally no change, but mechanically we'll have to make some changes internally in our systems to make this through. So we'll finish with conclusions here, and they're pretty obvious from what we talked so far. So the current intertie scheduling constraints do not accurately enforce transmission rights and transmission segments along the scheduling path. We provided an example to show that. Whereas the enhanced scheduling limit constraints accurately enforce transmission rights and transmission segments without impact in scheduling, settlement, and tagging. And we continue that example to show how this works with the ESLC. All right, I know this is all new, and you'll take some time to think through this. I'm pretty sure you'll have questions. If you have questions now, ask them, but we will entertain questions later after you have some chance to think through this. Not bad, 4 o'clock.
I'm not seeing any hands raised at this time.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to the next steps and just finish out with the So we'll be publishing tomorrow the stakeholder comment template, and those comments are requested by June 29th. If you need an additional day or so, feel free to reach out. We certainly can accommodate that. And the comments, questions will request some additional or more specific input from stakeholders to the extent that that hasn't been provided to date in past comments. So we encourage you to really consider the differences between the SP tie and the gap tie design. Are there additional questions, or is there additional information that will be helpful in helping us evaluate and helping the stakeholder community evaluate the different designs and moving to the gap tie design? I do want to note that if you recall, when we established the transitional design earlier this year that FERC approved, it was part of the compromise that we reached with stakeholders, and that stakeholders supported that while we will retain this transitional design for SP tie modeling, we'll continue to model things the way we did. Stakeholders did support that we will continue to evaluate moving to the gap tie design, which is what this effort is doing. We haven't yet made a formal proposal, but we want to evaluate with stakeholders what are the impacts of moving to that gap tie design, so that we go into this wide open and consider the implications as opposed to straight jumping to that gap tie design. We want to be mindful of those impacts to your commercial arrangements, other implications that we may want to consider. So please, in your comments, the more definitive you can be on your perspectives on moving to the gap tie design, more definitive you can be on things that will help improve your understanding of it, additional data or information that can help make more informed evaluations of moving to this design or considering the trade-off between how we model those intertie schedules. By all means, please include that in the comment questions that we will craft. We'll solicit that kind of more specific input from all of you. The next workshop we're looking to schedule in July. It will be informed by some of your comments. We may bring in some additional information that we covered here based on the comments that we received. But a substantive element that we want to start talking about in the next workshop is scheduling at the EDAM internal intertie, the internal intertie between the CAISO balancing area and an EDAM balancing area. The design or the intent is that there's no scheduling that's supported at those interties because they now support transfers and create certain inefficiencies of allowing bidding at those interties. We'll talk through that and consider what may be the impacts, mitigations, or whatever other implications may be of considering phasing that out. But we encourage you to participate in that workshop as well and prepare for that second step of the discussions. We've covered now 3 or so workshops on gap tie design. Now we want to talk a little bit about internal bidding on the internal EDAM interties, and is there a way to phase that out, and what are the impacts? And then I noted here on this next step slide some of the schedule for the initiative. That depending on how these workshops go, we may be in a position to have a proposal in Q3 of this year, and then iterate as necessary, depending on the level of consensus or lack thereof that we establish in these working groups. There may be iterative proposals between last quarter of this year, first quarter of next year, ultimately bringing this for a decision in Q2, publishing a final proposal, bringing that for decision to the board, so that it can support, and we have a design that we know where we land, and supporting the fall 2027 entrance into the EDAM, and how we're going to model intertie schedules on the ISO intertie, but also how we're going to treat internal interties between the ISO and another EDAM balancing area. Any questions before we adjourn?
I'm not seeing any questions coming in.
Okay, well then just thank you all for bearing with us a little bit past the time. Feel free to reach out to us offline if there are any additional questions on anything that we covered today, but certainly appreciate your patience and look forward to your comments. Turn it over to you, Christina.
Thanks, Milos. I'll be really quick, just running through these next slides. We have our usual meetings occurring this week at the ISO. And then here are some DAM and EDAM resources. And here's some information on market simulations and business practice manual updates. And then for insights into the ISO grid and market operations, be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog. And then here's some details on the launch of a new publication series at the ISO. It offers insights into notable developments across the Western power markets. And lastly, if you're interested in registering for the Stakeholder Symposium on October 5th and 6th, you can visit this link, and there are sponsorship opportunities available as well. So with that, we thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
All right, that concludes our conference. You may now disconnect.